1927. Fall asleep to Hilarious History, The Lone Eagle and the Talking Reel. In the narrative style of Mark Twain. Copyright 2026, James Henderson. Chapter 1. The Lone Eagle's Insomnia. By 1927, the 20th century had finally managed to kick its own internal combustion engine into high gear, discarding the brakes and accelerating with the reckless, gleeful abandon of a schoolboy on a stolen bicycle. It was a year that possessed an unquenchable thirst for the absurd and a curious, twitchy addiction to the new. Humanity, having spent the previous decade cleaning up the blood and debris of a great war, had decided that the best way to handle the future was to simply outrun it. And indeed, the world was moving with such frantic, jittery speed that one could hardly blame it for feeling a bit lightheaded. It was the sort of year where a man could become the most famous creature on this spinning green marble simply by refusing to indulge in the basic human necessity of slumber for 33 hours while suspended over a very large, very wet, and quite indifferent Atlantic Ocean. It was a year where a movie reel, previously content to simply flutter in silence, cleared its metallic throat and spoke its first coherent words, much to the alarm of every actor who had built a career on expressive eyebrow lifting. The stock market, that great glittering casino of the American imagination, climbed so high into the stratosphere that the common man, a fellow usually destined for nothing more exciting than a steady trade and a moderate pension, began to believe that poverty had been struck dead by the click-clack of the ticker-tape machine. It was a time of gold-leafed optimism, where the air felt thin and electric, like the moments just before a summer thunderstorm that promises to wash the streets clean, but might just as easily tear the roof off the barn. In the month of May, while the rest of the world was busy arguing over trifles or staring blankly into their morning coffee, a lean, 25-year-old male pilot named Charles Lindbergh, a fellow who looked as though he had been whittled out of a spare piece of hickory by a man who valued efficiency above all else, decided to do something remarkably foolish. He stuffed a few sandwiches, which I suspect were neither fresh nor particularly appetizing, into the silver cockpit of a machine that looked like a bird suffering from a severe case of overconfidence. And he took off from New York with the casual air of a man going to the post office. 33 hours later, he landed in Paris. He emerged from his metal cocoon not as a tired mailman, but as a global deity. It is a peculiar facet of the human race that we are always hunting for gods, and finding the genuine sort being quite difficult. We are usually satisfied with anyone who manages to survive a dangerous stunt without tripping over his own shoelaces. Lindbergh had done exactly that, surviving on a diet of stubbornness, gasoline fumes, and enough nervous energy to power a small town. The world, exhausted by its own mundane failures, latched on to this young man with the desperation of a drowning sailor clutching a floating piano. They cheered him because he had made the vast, howling void of the Atlantic seem as trivial as a stroll across a village green. But what, one might ask, is the true nature of this fame we so hungrily bestow? It is a fleeting, fickle thing, much like a butterfly that lands on your nose only to fly away the moment you decide to appreciate it. By the time the ticker tape began to fall in New York, 1,800 tons of shredded paper, a monument to our collective inability to contain our own enthusiasm, it was clear that humanity would cheerfully bury a man in garbage if only they liked the look of his chin. The streets were a canyon of confetti, a blizzard of discarded business documents, all sacrificed to the altar of a boy who just wanted to fly a plane. It was a spectacle of such magnificent absurdity that one could almost hear the past chuckling into its sleeve. We, the residents of this bustling, noisy decade, fancy ourselves masters of the machine. We have replaced the horse with the engine, the letter with the telegram, and the honest silence of a starlit night with the constant crackling hum of the radio. We tell ourselves that we are progressing, that we are climbing the ladder of civilization, rung by iron rung. But one cannot help but notice that every time we reach for the heavens, we bring a bit of the mud with us. We invent the telephone to bridge the gap between hearts, and then we use it to talk about the weather and the neighbors. We invent the airplane to shrink the globe, and we fill the skies with the roar of our own importance. It is a curious predicament. We live in a world where the ticker-tape machine is the final arbiter of truth, where the speed of the message is valued far above the content of the thought. The economy is a fever dream, a grand pyramid constructed of whispers and I owe us. And yet every man in the street behaves as if he has discovered the secret to perpetual wealth, as if gravity itself had been repealed by a vote of the local stock exchange. They are walking on the ceiling, convinced that the floor has simply moved, unaware that when the inevitable stumble arrives, the fall will be quite spectacular. But why fret? The gin is cold, the music is fast, and the century is young. 1927 is a party where nobody wants to be the first to suggest that the lights are beginning to flicker. We have our talking pictures to drown out the silence, our flying aces to distract us from our own feet, and a ticker-tape machine that purrs like a contented cat. We have managed, through a combination of sheer luck and a staggering amount of hubris, to convince ourselves that we are the peak of everything that has ever been and everything that ever will be. It is, I suppose, the natural state of things to believe that one's own time is the center of the universe. History, that stern and often uninvited guest, will eventually show up to offer its own assessment. But for now, we are busy. We are chasing records, shouting into microphones, and throwing paper at heroes. We are, in every sense of the word, a roaring, rattling, and remarkably loud collection of dreamers, hurtling toward a horizon that we are far too busy to actually look at. And if the path ahead is paved with the shards of our own inventions, well, we shall simply drive over them in the newest model, provided it has a gear shift. For in 1927, to move at all is to be alive, and to stop moving is to risk actually having to think about where we are going, and heaven forbid we do that. Chapter 2, The Ticker-Tape Avalanche. When the lone eagle returned to the shores of his native land, he was not merely a man. He was a phenomenon, a living proof that a human being could survive in a vacuum of his own making. The city of New York, a place that prides itself on being entirely unimpressed by anything that does not involve a bank heist or a Broadway opening, decided that it simply had to surrender its collective senses. The result was a parade that remains to this day the most impressive display of municipal littering in the history of the Republic. One must understand that New York in the late 20s did not merely welcome a hero. It attempted to smother him in his own celebrity. They took 1,800 tons of paper, ledgers, brochures, discarded love letters, and enough business correspondence to keep a lawyer in luxury for 3 generations. And they shredded it with the ferocity of a wood chipper. Then they climbed into the upper floors of their skyscrapers and dumped the whole lot of it out the windows, turning the financial district into a vertical blizzard of white confetti. The intention, one assumes, was to honor the young aviator. The effect, however, was to provide a perfect illustration of the modern American spirit. We are a people who love a man so much that we are perfectly willing to bury him in trash to prove it. I stood there, metaphorically speaking, watching the ticker tape drift down like the shed feathers of some gargantuan dying bird. It was a dizzying sight. There went a stock tip that would have made a fortune caught in an updraft. There went a divorce decree fluttering toward the gutter. There went a grocery bill that had been debated for a week, now nothing more than a piece of debris in a sky filled with the discarded anxieties of 10 million citizens. It was the absolute, unadulterated triumph of the ephemeral over the permanent. Lindbergh, sitting in his car as it crawled through the narrow canyons of Wall Street, must have felt like a man being attacked by the very documents of his own civilization. He was the hero of the hour, yet he could barely see the road through the swirling mist of paper. It is the perfect metaphor for the age, really. We have created a world where the noise is so deafening and the distractions are so plentiful that the actual reality of a human life is completely obscured by the sheer volume of our own observations about it. The crowd was a sea of faces, all looking upward, all shouting, all possessed by that peculiar frantic energy that defines our time. They weren't just cheering for a pilot, they were cheering for the idea that a man could simply leave. He had left the ground, he had left the country, and for a glorious 33 hours he had left the suffocating gravity of the human condition behind. And here he was, back again, and the people were trying to drag him down with the weight of their own adoration. It is a curious thing, fame. It is a mirror that shows you exactly what the world wants to see, but never who you actually are. To the public, Lindbergh was a symbol, a clean-cut, stoic, daring representative of American potential. To himself, I imagine he was just a young man who had spent a very long time in a very small seat, wondering if his engine would hold together and if he had brought enough sandwiches. The gap between the symbol and the man is where the comedy lies, provided you are not the one forced to live in that gap. There was a man standing next to me, a broker, I suspect, judging by the desperation in his eyes, who was shouting until his face turned a rather alarming shade of purple. He was screaming for Lindbergh to look at him as if a brief glance from the aviator might somehow improve his portfolio. The absurdity of it was enough to make a stone statue break into a grin. Here was a man who spent his days chasing numbers that moved faster than a startled jackrabbit, and he was pinning his entire sense of existence on a boy who had done nothing more than stay awake in a metal box. I reflected, as the blizzard of paper intensified, on the nature of our progress. We are obsessed with speed. We want our ships faster, our trains faster, our messages instantaneous. We believe that if we can just move fast enough, we will outrun the fundamental unhappiness that stalks every human life. And perhaps we are right. Certainly, no one had time to think about the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, or the mounting debt of the farmers, or the fact that the entire economy was essentially a game of musical chairs played by people who had forgotten that the music might eventually stop. The ticker tape, as it turns out, is the perfect material for such a celebration. It is the language of the market, the physical representation of our belief in invisible values. And there it was, fallen into the street, completely useless, completely symbolic, and entirely beautiful in its pointlessness. It reminded me of the old saying about the fool and his money, though in this case the fool was the entire city, and the money had been turned into confetti for the sake of a moment's hysteria. As the parade progressed, the street became so clogged with paper that the cars could barely move. It was a gridlock of celebration. One could imagine a disgruntled street cleaner staring at the mess and weeping into his broom, for he knew that by tomorrow the ticker tape would be nothing but soggy, ink-stained pulp, a chore to be swept into the darkness. But for that afternoon, it was glorious. It was a collective delusion, a shared hallucination, that if we all screamed loud enough and threw enough paper at the hero, we would be spared from the boring, grind-like reality of the everyday. And what of the hero? He remained, by all accounts, remarkably unruffled. He sat there, a young man who had stared into the void of the Atlantic and found nothing but wind and water, now staring into the void of New York and finding nothing but madness. He was the only calm point in a storm of human energy. Perhaps that is why we loved him so much. We were all running in circles, trying to build something that would last, and he was the one who had simply flown away and come back. We wanted to know his secret, but he didn't have one. He just had a plane. The crowd, of course, did not care about the reality. They wanted the myth. They wanted the lone eagle to be perfect, to be silent, to be untouchable. And so they buried him in paper, effectively erasing the man and replacing him with a monument of their own making. It was a masterful act of creation. They took a pilot and turned him into a legend, and then they made sure that the legend was so heavily decorated with ticker tape that no one would ever be able to see the man underneath. One has to admire the efficiency of it. We are a nation of organizers, after all. We organize our cities, we organize our businesses, and we organize our heroes. We give them parades, we give them medals, and then we wait for them to do something else to keep us entertained. But there is a sadness to it, too. For the moment the parade ends, the ticker tape is swept away, and the hero is left standing in the street, wondering where everyone went. The year 1927 would continue in this vein, a frantic, loud, and brilliantly messy affair. The world was changing, spinning forward into a future that promised everything and guaranteed nothing. And we, the passengers on this hurtling vessel, were so busy throwing paper at one another that we didn't notice the horizon was starting to look a little bit stormy. But why look at the horizon when there is a parade in front of you? Why think about the destination when the journey is so wonderfully, ridiculously noisy? The ticker tape fell, the city cheered, and for a few hours the world seemed to make perfect sense, provided one didn't look too closely at the details. We were a nation in love with the sound of our own applause, and we didn't want the music to stop, even if the conductor had already left the podium. It is a grand, whimsical, and utterly doomed enterprise, this living in the modern world. We are all of us, to some degree, pilots of our own little metal boxes, trying to cross the ocean without falling into the waves. And if occasionally we manage to land in Paris, well, we should expect a few tons of trash to be thrown at us in return. It's the price of admission, and quite frankly, it's a bargain, even if it does make a terrible mess of the sidewalk. Chapter 3. the Pacific's high price. While the Atlantic had been conquered by a solitary young man and a bucketful of sheer, unadulterated grit, the Pacific Ocean, a vastly larger and significantly more ill-tempered body of water, decided that it would not be trifled with by such trivialities as male pilots. The Pacific is a cold, brooding giant of a sea, a place where a man can drift for days while staring at the horizon and contemplating his own insignificance. It does not suffer from the sort of hero worship that plagues the city of New York. It is quite indifferent to whether you have a parade, a ticker tape machine, or a gold medal. It is only interested in whether you are buoyant. In this year of 1927, when the entire world seemed to have developed a collective case of aviator's fever, a pineapple magnate by the name of Dole, a fellow who clearly understood that if you have enough money, you can convince people to do anything, decided to offer a handsome prize for the first flight from California to the islands of Hawaii. It was a tempting sum of money, the sort of figure that causes a man to look at his own mortality and conclude that it is a small price to pay for the chance to have his name printed in the newspapers. A dozen amateur aviators, brave souls with more ambition than sense, threw their hats into the ring. They were a motley crew. Some were experienced barnstormers who had spent their lives dodging fence posts and cows. Others were daring youngsters who had barely learned to land a plane without breaking their own legs. And all of them were possessed by that uniquely American conviction that if you just push an engine hard enough, it will eventually stop complaining and cooperate. The departure from California was a festive affair. There were bands playing, politicians giving speeches that lasted long enough for the audience to grow beards, and wives and sweethearts waving handkerchiefs as if the boys were off on a leisurely yachting trip instead of attempting to cross 2,000 miles of empty, unforgiving brine. The planes, a hodgepodge of wings and wire, looked like fragile insects preparing to challenge a hurricane. They buzzed and sputtered on the runway, smelling of high-octane gasoline and desperation. It is a curious thing to witness the birth of a tragedy. You see the smiles, you hear the cheers, and you feel the electricity of the crowd, all while knowing that the odds are stacked against the travelers in a way that would make a gambler blush. But that is the secret of the 1920s. We are all so enamored with the possibility of success that we have completely blinded ourselves to the probability of failure. We see the flight, we see the goal, and we ignore the abyss that lies in between. The tragedy, when it arrived, did not do so with a flourish of trumpets. It was a quiet, creeping sort of disaster. One by one, the planes began to fail. An engine would cough, a fuel line would snap, or a navigator would look at the map and realize that he had been looking at the wrong part of the ocean for the last 6 hours. They didn't just crash, they vanished. They sank beneath the waves, leaving behind nothing but a few ripples and a lingering sense of absence that the newspapers would try to fill with patriotic platitudes and stories of valiant sacrifice. It is a grim reminder that while Lindbergh made it look as easy as falling off a log, gravity, aided by the vast, yawning indifference of the sea, still wins most of its matches. Lindbergh was a freak of nature, a man who possessed a supernatural ability to keep his eyes on the prize and his hand on the throttle. The rest of the world, unfortunately, is not made of such iron. We are made of flesh, blood, and a terrifying amount of fallibility. The Pacific is not a place for amateurs. It is a place where you are on your own, where the stars are your only map, and where the water is deep enough to hide 1,000 secrets. To fly over it is to realize in a very sudden and uncomfortable way that the world is much bigger than we are. When you are in a plane, you are a master of the air. When the engine dies, you are merely a passenger in a sinking crate, waiting for the ocean to decide your fate. The Pineapple Prize did not bring glory. It brought misery. It turned a feat of engineering into a spectacle of vanity. One wonders what the magnate thought as he watched the headlines change from "The Great Adventure" to "The Search for the Lost Aviators." I imagine he felt a touch of regret, though he likely salved it with a nice cold glass of juice. Money has a way of cushioning the soul against the sharp edges of reality. We, as a people, are deeply committed to the idea that there is no problem that cannot be solved by a sufficient application of technology. We think that if we make a faster engine, a better compass, or a stronger wing, we have conquered nature. But nature, I am afraid, is a very old and very stubborn opponent. She does not care about our technology. She does not care about our progress. She only cares about the balance of things, and occasionally she decides that the balance needs a little bit of adjusting. The loss of these men was a dark shadow on an otherwise bright and giddy year. It was a moment when the optimism of 1927 stuttered. People looked at the papers, saw the names of the missing, and felt a cold chill that not even the fastest jazz record could thaw. For a moment, the world stopped spinning quite so fast. For a moment, we were forced to look at the truth. We were children playing with fire in a world that was much larger, much darker, and much more dangerous than we had dared to imagine. And yet, the very next week, we were back to our business. The ticker tape machines were still clicking, the movies were still talking, and the stock market was still climbing. We are an resilient species, or perhaps just a forgetful one. We possess a remarkable capacity to ignore the lessons that history tries to teach us. We bury our dead, we mourn for a polite interval, and then we go right back to throwing parties, as if the party itself is a shield against the inevitable. Perhaps that is our greatest strength, or perhaps it is our most profound weakness. We do not like to look at the bill after the feast is over. We do not like to consider that for every victory like Lindbergh's, there are a dozen losses that go unrecorded, or worse, are turned into cautionary tales that no one bothers to read. We are a people of the moment, living in a perpetual state of now, convinced that the future is just a bigger, brighter, and more expensive version of the present. The Pacific, however, remains. It is still vast, it is still cold, and it is still indifferent. It does not care about our prizes, our airplanes, or our headlines. It is a reminder that we are small, fragile creatures clinging to a thin layer of habitable space, constantly trying to transcend our own limitations. Sometimes we succeed, and we become heroes. Most of the time, we fail, and we become nothing more than a memory, a name in a newspaper that will be used to wrap a fish by the following Friday. It is a sobering thought, but one that is necessary if we are to understand the true character of this century. We are dreamers, yes, but we are dreamers who are occasionally woken up by the hard, cold slap of reality. And if we choose to go back to sleep and dream again, well, that is the human way. We are not designed to stare at the ocean for too long. We are designed to fly, or at least to pretend that we can. And so we continue to build our planes. We continued to chase our prizes. We continued to look for ways to make the world smaller, even as we are constantly reminded of how big it truly is. We are a spectacle of human stubbornness, a collection of souls trying to prove that we are more than just accidents of biology. We are, in our own small, loud, and often foolish way, trying to write our own history, even if we are writing it on the surface of an ocean that is waiting to wash it all away. In the end, the Pacific's high price was not paid in dollars, but in the lives of men who dared to believe that they could outrun the sea. They failed, of course, but there is a certain dignity in the attempt. They were, for a brief moment, the equals of the wind. And in a world that is obsessed with the bottom line, perhaps that is worth something, even if the ledger shows a loss. The ocean doesn't keep accounts. It only keeps the sea. And as for us, we have the memories, the stories, and the uncomfortable knowledge that sometimes the only way to win is to stay on the ground and watch the others fly. Chapter 4, You Ain't Heard Nothin' Yet. If you have ever had the distinct misfortune of attending a lecture delivered by a man who insists on whispering his profoundest insights into his own shirt collar, you will have some appreciation for the silent film industry as it stood in the year of our Lord, 1927. For decades, the motion picture had been a visual feast, a parade of pantomime, where the actors threw their arms about with the grace of wind-milled windmills, and the scenery did all the heavy lifting of the narrative. It was a world of pure, unadulterated gesture. If a fellow wanted to express love, he clutched his bosom as if he were trying to contain a runaway heart. If he wanted to express villainy, he twirled his mustache with such vigor that one worried for the structural integrity of his lip. It was a grand, noisy, colorful, and utterly silent charade. Then came Al Jolson, a man of formidable energy and a voice that could crack a stained-glass window at 50 paces. He stood before a camera in a production called The Jazz Singer, opened his mouth, and uttered a phrase that would echo through the corridors of history, with all the subtlety of a steam locomotive entering a library. "You ain't heard nothin' yet," he declared, and he was right. The audience, who had been content to watch movies with the musical accompaniment of a piano player who usually spent the entire performance trying to synchronize the tempo with his own indigestion, were suddenly struck dumb. The film industry, until that very moment, was a well-oiled machine of silence. It was a kingdom ruled by stars who possessed the most expressive eyebrows in Christendom, and who had never once been required to say a word in the performance of their duties. Suddenly, the ground shifted. The silent screen, that great, comfortable blanket of quietude, was ripped away, and in its place was a cacophony of recorded speech, screeching music, and the terrifying, unpredictable reality of human sound. It was a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. If Shakespeare had been a talent scout for a studio that had just realized its entire roster of leading men were incapable of speaking a coherent sentence without sounding like a goat with a head cold. Thousands of actors who had spent their lives perfecting the art of the meaningful glare suddenly found themselves obsolete by Tuesday morning. It is a harsh thing to be cast aside by progress. One day, you are the toast of Hollywood, the idol of every schoolgirl from Maine to California, and the next day, you are a relic, a silent statue in a world that has suddenly developed a desperate, driving need to hear you recite your lines. The panic that ensued in the studios was a sight to behold. It was as if a fire had broken out in the middle of a masquerade ball. Directors were running about, screaming for sound engineers to save them from their own performers. Actresses with voices like rusty hinges were being hastily replaced by chorus girls who could hold a tune, even if they couldn't act their way out of a paper bag. It was the great weeding out of the vocally challenged, a purge of the silent and the squeaky. One must consider the sheer unmitigated gall of it all. We have finally figured out how to make light dance on a screen, and the very first thing we decide to do with this miracle is to fill the room with the sound of someone singing a song about his mother. It is, perhaps, the most human of responses. Give us a tool that could change the world, and we will use it to make the world slightly more annoying. I watched, with a mixture of amusement and pity, as the old guard tried to adapt. They took lessons in elocution, they practiced their vowels, and they spent hours in front of mirrors, trying to make their faces look as if they were actually capable of forming words. It was a pathetic display, like watching a man try to teach a goldfish to recite the Declaration of Independence. The silent stars had their own language, a language of subtle shifts, of shadow and light, of the slow blink and the meaningful tilt of the chin. To force them to speak was to strip them of their soul. It was like taking a master painter and forcing him to describe his masterpiece in a series of grunts. But the audience, that great, fickle, hungry beast, did not care. They wanted to hear the movies. They wanted the illusion to be complete. They wanted the man on the screen to talk back to them, to sing to them, to make jokes that they could actually understand without having to read a card that popped up every 3 minutes to explain what was happening. And so, the studios gave them what they wanted. They wired the theaters for sound, they invested in microphones, and they ushered in the era of the talkie. The result was a revolution, albeit one that sounded suspiciously like a series of explosions and hisses. The early talkies were not, by any stretch of the imagination, works of art. They were technical nightmares. The actors had to speak into hidden microphones that were buried in flower pots, inside telephones, or underneath the rugs. They spent half the film trying to remember to stand in exactly the right spot, like a group of stiff-necked soldiers waiting for a drill sergeant. If they moved their heads an inch to the left, the sound disappeared. If they breathed too hard, the microphone would pick it up and turn it into the sound of a hurricane. It was, in short, a disaster of magnificent proportions, and yet it was a hit. The public ate it up. They didn't care if the dialogue was wooden or if the sound was scratchy. They were mesmerized by the novelty. They were witnessing the birth of a new god, a deity of pure vibration. I found myself wondering, in the midst of all this noise, what had been lost. We have gained the ability to hear the characters, but have we lost the ability to imagine them? In the silent films, we were partners in the creation. We provided the voices, we imagined the emotions, and we filled in the blanks with our own experiences. Now everything is provided for us. The actor speaks, the music plays, and we are reduced to the role of passive observers, waiting to be entertained by the next loud noise. The talkies, for all their technical wizardry, have a way of narrowing the imagination. When you hear a man speak, he becomes a specific person with a specific tone and a specific accent. When he is silent, he is everyone. He is the projection of our own dreams. The silence allowed us to build castles in the air, but the talkies have brought us back down to the ground, where the dialogue is scripted, the music is canned, and the actors are just people who are very good at following instructions. Still, one cannot stop the march of progress, even when it is moving in a direction that seems, at least to my old-fashioned sensibilities, a bit like a march toward the trivial. The jazz singer was the death knell of the silent era, and there was no use crying over the spilled ink of the title cards. The future was noisy, and if we wanted to be a part of it, we would have to learn to listen. I walked out of the theater, the sound of Al Jolson's voice still ringing in my ears, and stepped into the bustling, noisy, and perfectly silent street. It was a jarring transition. The world was so much quieter than the movie. Or perhaps it was just that I had finally learned how to hear the silence. It is a fragile, fleeting thing, the quiet. It is the canvas upon which our lives are painted. And as the world gets louder, as the movies get talkier, and as the ticker tape machines continue to click, I suspect that the silence is going to become a luxury that fewer and fewer people can afford. But that is the way of the world in 1927. We are in such a hurry to be heard that we have forgotten how to listen. We have replaced the subtle with the loud, the meaningful with the obvious, and the timeless with the new. And yet there is a certain strange charm to it all. It is a chaotic, messy, and brilliantly loud era, and we are right in the middle of it, trying to catch the words before they disappear into the ether. You ain't heard nothing yet. Indeed, I fear we have already heard entirely too much, but I shall keep my seat, keep my counsel, and see what the next act has in store. Chapter 5. The Funeral of the Tin Lizzie. There are few things in this world more stubborn than a man who has convinced himself that he has invented the absolute peak of utility. Henry Ford was such a man, and his Model T was his masterpiece. For 19 years, that little black carriage rattled across the globe, transforming the American landscape from a series of isolated farmsteads into a singular, interconnected sprawl of tire tracks and broken fences. It was a vehicle that demanded nothing but a little gasoline, a bit of oil, and the occasional sacrifice of a fingernail when you tried to crank the engine in the dead of a Michigan winter. It was a machine of the people, for the people, and by the grace of the assembly line, affordable for the people. But as 1927 dawned, Henry found himself in a predicament that only the most successful men ever encounter. He had become a prisoner of his own success. He was like a man who had built a very efficient, very reliable, and very dull house, and was then surprised to find that his children wanted to paint the walls a different color, or perhaps move a window to catch the morning sun. For years, the public had been hinting, then suggesting, and finally demanding that perhaps, just perhaps, a car might be improved by the addition of something more sophisticated than a 2-speed planetary transmission. They wanted a gear shift that didn't require the dexterity of a concert pianist to operate, and they wanted a body that didn't look like a leftover prop from a Victorian carriage funeral. But Henry, who possessed a jawline that could serve as a paperweight for the Library of Congress, remained unmoved. "The customer can have any color he wants," he famously remarked, "so long as it is black." It was a marvelous philosophy for a tyrant, but a disastrous one for a merchant, and so the world simply moved on without him. The Chevrolet began to whisper in the ears of the common man, offering a bit more style, a bit more comfort, and a transmission that didn't require a master's degree in mechanical engineering. Henry watched his sales numbers dip, then plummet, then do a backflip into the abyss. He was the king of the road, but he was rapidly becoming the king of a graveyard. Finally, in a fit of pique that could only be described as industrial-grade stubbornness, Henry did the unthinkable. He shut it all down. He didn't just stop the assembly line. He effectively mothballed his entire empire. He sent his workers home, closed the heavy steel doors of the Highland Park plant, and retreated into his drawing office to do what he should have done a decade earlier: design a car that people actually wanted to drive. It was a funeral, in every sense of the word, the funeral of an era. The death of the Tin Lizzie was a moment that sent a shiver through the heart of the American economy. Everyone knew a Model T. Your grandfather had driven one. Your neighbor had spent his Sunday afternoons lying underneath one, caked in grease and muttering prayers to a deity he didn't even believe in. It was the chariot of the middle class, the mechanical donkey that had pulled the nation into the 20th century. To see it go was to realize that the world was once again leaving us behind. I spent some time contemplating this during those long, quiet months while the factories stood silent. It is a peculiar human trait, this emotional attachment to our tools. We treat our machines as if they have souls, as if they understand the service they provide. A man will forgive a car for being unreliable, for leaking oil on his driveway, and for refusing to start when he is already late for church. But he will not forgive it for being obsolete. There is a melancholy in the march of progress that we rarely acknowledge. We are always trading in the old friend for a shinier, faster, and more soulless version, and we call it improvement. When the new machine finally emerged, the Model A, it was greeted with a kind of frantic anticipation usually reserved for the return of a lost army. People stood in line for days, shivering in the cold, just to catch a glimpse of the new design. And what did they see? They saw a car that was, by all accounts, a car. It had gears, it had style, and it had a color palette that did not begin and end with midnight soot. Henry had done it. He had swallowed his pride, digested his hubris, and emerged with something that could actually compete in the modern market. It was a triumph of adaptation. But as I watched the first Model A roll off the line, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sadness. The Tin Lizzie had possessed a character that the new machine lacked. It was a plucky, noisy, and remarkably honest little beast. It was a product of an age where you were expected to understand your machine, to know its temper and its quirks, and to respect it for what it was. The new car, with its smooth curves and its sophisticated internal organs, was a product of an age where the machine was expected to serve you without complaint or complication. We have gained comfort, certainly. We have gained reliability, and we have gained the ability to drive from one end of the country to the other without having to dismantle the engine once a week. But we have lost the intimacy. We have turned the automobile into an appliance, a glorified toaster with wheels, and in doing so, we have made the act of driving a rather dull and solitary experience. I find myself wondering what the future holds for the driver of the next century. Will he ever know the joy of a balky clutch? Will he ever experience the thrill of a radiator that decides to vent its spleen in the middle of a traffic jam? Will he ever look at his car and see a partner in his struggle against the miles? Or will he just see a device that is supposed to get him from here to there without him having to think about it? Henry Ford, in his own way, was the architect of our modern disconnection. He gave us the world, but he asked us to sacrifice our mechanical curiosity in exchange. He built an empire on the back of a car that forced us to engage with the physical world, and then he killed it because we wanted something that would let us ignore the road entirely. The funeral of the Tin Lizzie was not just the end of a product line, it was the end of an age of innocence. It was the moment we decided that we preferred the comfort of the passenger seat to the engagement of the driver's chair. We wanted to move faster, we wanted to move smoother, and we wanted to do it without getting our hands dirty. And Henry, the most brilliant and stubborn of us all, gave us exactly what we asked for. As the last Model T rolled into the history books, I raised a glass, metaphorically of course, to the little car that could. It had been a wild, rattling, and remarkably successful ride. We had crossed the plains, climbed the mountains, and muddied the fields in that humble little machine. And if it eventually had to go, well, it had earned its rest. It had taken us as far as it could, and it had done so with a spirit that we are unlikely to see again in an age of factory-perfect, mass-produced convenience. The Model A was a success, of course. It was a fine car. It was a better car. But it was not the Tin Lizzie. It was not the machine that taught us how to drive, how to break down, and how to get back on the road again. It was a machine for the new world, a world of speed, of style, and of silence. And as I watched the crowds cheer for the new arrival, I couldn't help but look back at the old black, rattling ghost of the Model T and offer a silent salute to the end of the road. We are all moving forward, but sometimes it is worth glancing in the rearview mirror to see what we have left behind in the dust. Chapter 6. Philo's Electronic Ghost. In the grand, bustling laboratory of the 19th century, we were content with the telegraph, a device that allowed a man to send a frantic message across a continent with all the grace of a stuttering woodpecker. It was slow, it was laborious, and it required a man to be awake at both ends of the line, which is a state of affairs that nature clearly never intended for a reasonable human being. But as we stumbled headlong into the middle of the 20s, the world decided that the telegraph was a tired old nag that needed to be put out to pasture. We wanted more. We wanted the light itself to carry our images, a feat that would surely impress the ghosts of all those ancient philosophers who had spent their lives staring at candles and wondering why things were the way they were. Enter a young fellow named Philo Farnsworth, a name that sounds suspiciously like it belongs in a book of fairy tales, but who was, in fact, a farm boy from Utah who had looked at the furrows of a plowed field and conceived of a way to carve the world into tiny, flickering lines of light. In a laboratory in San Francisco, surrounded by enough vacuum tubes and tangled copper wire to choke a locomotive, Philo was busy teaching the ether how to hold a picture. The process was and remains a marvel of sheer, unadulterated madness. Imagine, if you will, taking a scene, say, a view of your neighbor's cat sitting on a fence, and attempting to slice it into 1,000 invisible ribbons. You then fire these ribbons through the air at the speed of light, only to have them reassembled on a glass screen at the other end with such frightening precision that the cat appears, albeit in a rather ghostly, greenish, and trembling state. It was an electronic séance, a way of summoning the spirit of a moment and trapping it in a box. Philo's first success was a straight line, just a single, solitary, lonely line. It didn't look like much, certainly not something that would threaten the sanctity of the human mind or the quiet of the dinner hour, but it was, in retrospect, the blueprint for the great glowing cage that would eventually claim us all. It was the moment the world decided that it was no longer enough to be where you were. You had to be everywhere, all at once, watching a screen that told you what to think, what to buy, and what to find amusing. I can see the young man now, eyes wide with the specific, feverish intensity of the inventor, peering into his contraption as if it were a crystal ball. He didn't know he was building a monster, of course. He thought he was just solving a technical puzzle, a grander version of a jigsaw. He was a pioneer, trekking into the wilderness of the electromagnetic spectrum, and he didn't realize that the trail he was blazing would eventually become a 6-lane highway paved with commercials and quiz shows. The image was, to put it mildly, disappointing. It was small, it was silent, and it was entirely useless for any practical purpose. One could not use it to signal a ship, or to warn of an incoming storm, or even to see if one's wife had finished baking the pie. It was a toy for the scientists, a parlor trick for the curious, and yet there was something about it that felt like a challenge to the heavens. We were taking the very stuff of light and making it do our bidding. It was the sort of hubris that usually precedes a very loud, very public fall, though at the time it just looked like progress. We, the human race, have a peculiar habit of inventing things and then immediately wondering how we ever lived without them. We are like children who, upon being given a new kite, immediately assume that the sky itself is a personal property. Philo's television was the kite. It was a fragile, temperamental, and remarkably inefficient bit of machinery. It flickered like a candle in a gale and produced pictures that would have been more at home in a nightmare than a living room. And yet, we looked at that flickering line and saw the future. We saw a world where we didn't have to leave our chairs to see the Orient, to watch a coronation, or to witness the latest disaster in a far-off land. The irony, of course, is that the more we have learned to see, the less we have learned to observe. We have built these marvelous windows into the world, and we use them to watch the most trivial and mind-numbing spectacles imaginable. We have taken the power of the gods and used it to turn ourselves into a nation of gluttons for the ephemeral. We sit in our darkened rooms, bathed in the blue, sickly glow of the cathode ray, and we let the world march past us on the screen, convinced that we are participating in history when, in fact, we are merely watching a reflection of it. But in 1927, that was all in the future. The television was still just an idea, a ghost in the machine, a promise of a time when the world would be shrunk down to the size of a screen. Philo was still in his laboratory, tinkering with his wires, unaware that he was constructing the very mechanism that would one day ensure that nobody in this great, beautiful, and noisy country would ever look at their neighbor or their spouse or their own children during dinner again. It is a fascinating, if slightly terrifying, prospect. We pride ourselves on our communication. We think that by connecting every corner of the globe with wires and waves, we are building a more unified humanity. But I suspect the opposite is true. We are building a world of islands. We are each of us ensconced in our own little bubble, surrounded by the flicker of our own chosen reality, and the distance between us, the real distance, the one measured in empathy and understanding, is growing wider by the day. Philo's ghost was a small, shy thing, a line that barely held its shape. It didn't shout. It didn't demand. It didn't sell anything. It just sat there, waiting to be noticed. But it was the seed of something that would eventually bloom into a forest of screens, a garden of distractions so vast and so dense that we would lose our way entirely. I wonder if Philo ever looked at that screen and saw, in the static, the shape of the world to come. I wonder if he saw the families sitting in silence, the children mesmerized by the flashing colors, the politicians speaking to millions but looking at no one. I doubt it. He was too busy with the engineering, too consumed by the desire to make the image clear, to make the line straight. That is the way of the inventor. He is so focused on the can that he rarely stops to consider the should. And so the year 1927 ticked on, a year of great leaps and small, flickering beginnings. We were moving so fast that the static of the past was being washed away by the new, clean, electric future. We were becoming masters of the air, pioneers of the ether, and we were doing it all with the confidence of a man walking a tightrope over a canyon, never realizing that the rope was fraying beneath his feet. Philo's television would wait, of course. It would take a few more years, a few more refinements, and a lot more money before it would be ready to invade the American home. But the die was cast. The ghost had been summoned. The electronic age had arrived, and it was going to be a loud, bright, and deeply, profoundly lonely place. And yet, I suppose we shall enjoy the view. We always do. We are, at our core, a curious people, and if we have to trade a bit of our silence for a little bit of flickering light, well, we have always been suckers for a good show, even if, in the end, it turns out that we were the ones being watched all along. Chapter 7. The Great Mississippi Inundation. The Mississippi River, that venerable mud-caked serpent which has served as the spine of this continent since before the first pilgrim tripped over a rock on the Atlantic coast, decided, in the spring of 1927, that it had quite enough of the local geography. It is the nature of the Mississippi to be a bit temperamental. It is a river of deep moods and even deeper silt. But in this particular year, it decided to stop being a river and start being an ocean. It burst its banks with the enthusiasm of a long-imprisoned man kicking down the door of his cell. And before anyone could say levee, 27,000 square miles of our fine nation were underwater. It was a flood of biblical proportions, though lacking the ark and the menagerie of animals that usually accompany such watery catastrophes. Instead, it brought us politics. It brought us the mud-soaked, weary, and ultimately career-defining arrival of Mr. Herbert Hoover, a man who possessed all the charm of a damp ledger and the logistical mind of a Swiss watchmaker. He was dispatched to the scene with a clipboard in one hand and a whistle in the other, charged with the gargantuan task of herding the displaced millions like so many wet, unhappy sheep. If you have never seen a flood, you have missed one of nature's most effective humiliations. There is something deeply chastening about watching your front porch sail down the road, preceded by your chicken coop and followed by your neighbor's piano. The water does not negotiate. It does not care about your property rights, your political affiliations, or the fact that you just finished painting the fence. It simply arrives, claims the furniture, and insists upon a change of scenery. As the waters rose, the land turned into a soggy, miserable mush. Hundreds of thousands of people found themselves homeless, huddled on the few remaining patches of high ground that had not yet been swallowed by the brown, churning soup of the Father of Waters. It was a scene of utter, despondent confusion. The livestock were mooing in treetops. The local politicians were wringing their hands in a desperate attempt to appear helpful, and the nation looked on through the lens of the newspaper, marveling at the sheer scale of the inconvenience. Mr. Hoover, however, was in his element. He was a man who believed that if you just organized the chaos would eventually have the decency to organize itself. He set up relief camps. He distributed supplies with the precision of a payroll clerk. And he made sure that every tent, every crate of crackers, and every bucket of potable water was accounted for. It was a marvelous display of American industriousness. We are a people who, when faced with a disaster, do not merely pray for a miracle. We form a committee. I watched, from a safe and dry distance, the way this flooded landscape began to reshape the ambitions of men. Hoover was not just saving lives. He was saving his reputation. Every sandbag he ordered placed, every refugee he registered, and every train car of supplies he directed was a brick in the foundation of his presidential campaign. It is a cynical thing to observe, perhaps, but one cannot help but notice that in this country, a well-managed catastrophe is often the most effective ladder to the White House. If you can show the people that you can manage their misery, they will happily trust you with their votes. The tragedy was that while the politicians were busy polishing their platforms, the people were living in the mud. There is no dignity in a flood. You are cold, you are wet, and you are surrounded by the smell of decay. You lose your history, your heirlooms, and your sense of place, all in the span of an afternoon. And yet, the human spirit is a stubborn, resilient, and utterly baffling thing. Even in the middle of a waist-deep swamp, people were still arguing about the weather, still playing cards, and still looking for someone to blame for the fact that the river had decided to move into their living rooms. One of the most peculiar sights of the whole ordeal was the reliance on the levee system. We spent years building these great walls of dirt and stone, convincing ourselves that we had finally tamed the river, that we had taught it to stay in its place like a good, obedient servant. But the river, which has a memory longer than any human generation, simply waited for us to turn our backs and then proceeded to tear our work to shreds. We built the levees too high, and the river simply decided to go over them, or under them, or through them, just to prove that we were still the same foolish children who thought we could command the tides. Hoover's relief effort, for all its bureaucratic splendor, was a massive, clanking machine that ignored the fundamental truth that a man who has lost his home is not just a unit of logistics. He is a person who is currently contemplating the end of the world, but the administration, in its infinite wisdom, treated the flood as if it were a manufacturing problem. If they could just get the input, food, blankets, tents, to match the output, survivors, they would be a success. And in a sense, they were. They kept the people alive. They kept the disease at bay. And they managed to keep the country from realizing just how much of its heartland was currently being repurposed as a riverbed. I wonder sometimes if we ever learn from these things. Every few decades, the Mississippi clears its throat, rolls up its sleeves, and takes back its property. And every few decades, we act as if it were a complete and utter surprise. We rebuild in the same spot. We construct the same fragile walls, and we wait for the next time the river decides it needs to stretch its legs. It is a cycle of optimism and disaster, a dance between human arrogance and the absolute indifference of nature. Perhaps that is what it means to be an American in 1927. We are a people who believe in our own permanence, even when the ground beneath our feet is liquid. We are a people who believe that we can legislate the rain, organize the floods, and build our way out of any problem, provided we have enough sandbags and a sufficiently organized committee. We look at the devastation, we check our watches, we adjust our collars, and we get back to work, convinced that if we just do it better next time, the river will finally learn to behave. It is a grand, noble, and ultimately misguided ambition. The Mississippi does not care about our votes, our relief committees, or our presidential aspirations. It only cares about the gravity, the rainfall, and the eternal, slow, and inevitable path toward the sea. We are but temporary residents on its banks, guests of the mud, and we would do well to remember that. As the waters finally receded, leaving behind a thick, stinking layer of silt that smelled like all the secrets of the continent had been turned inside out, the world moved on. Hoover went to Washington. The displaced families went back to rebuild their broken lives. And the river resumed its course, flowing along as if it hadn't just rearranged the map of the United States. We had learned nothing, of course. We had simply survived. And in this year of 1927, that was considered a triumph. But I suspect that if you go down to the banks today and listen very closely, you can still hear the river chuckling to itself. It knows something we don't. It knows that all our cities, all our levees, and all our grand plans are just sand castles in a tide that never sleeps. And yet, we keep building, we keep hoping, we keep trying to put a fence around the ocean, and when it inevitably breaks, we simply order another gallon of paint and start again. It's a wonderful, frantic, and entirely human way to live, and I suppose, given the alternative, I wouldn't have it any other way. But it does make one wonder if, just once, we might consider moving the house to higher ground. Just a suggestion, mind you, for the next time the Father of Waters decides he's had enough of our company. Chapter 8. The Global Scream for Sacco and Vanzetti. If you ever wish to observe the curious nature of human justice, or as I prefer to call it, the art of applying a heavy hammer to a delicate problem, you need look no further than the long, agonizing saga of Sacco and Vanzetti. It was a case that had everything. Two Italian immigrants with ideas that made the comfortable classes reach for their smelling salts, a robbery in Massachusetts that ended in a pair of funerals, and a legal process that moved with the speed and elegance of a mud-caked wagon trying to climb a greased incline. By 1927, the case had ceased to be a matter of law and had become a matter of theater. It was the longest-running performance in the history of the Bay State, and everyone had a ticket. From the cafes of Paris to the windy streets of Buenos Aires, people were marching, shouting, and occasionally lobbing a stick of dynamite into a convenient window, all to show their solidarity with two men who were, at the heart of it, just a couple of shoemakers with a fondness for anarchism and a profound lack of social grace. It is a singular mystery of our species. Why does the whole world suddenly become obsessed with the fate of two strangers in a distant courtroom? I suspect it is because we are all, deep down, frightened of the law. We know that the law is not a divine instrument of truth, but rather a machine operated by men who are just as prone to prejudice, sleepiness, and the influence of a heavy lunch as the rest of us. When we see the law go wrong, we feel a shiver of recognition. It is like seeing the neighborhood bully suddenly put on a judge's robe. We scream because we are terrified that, given the wrong set of circumstances, the hammer might eventually find its way to our own fingers. Sacco and Vanzetti were not saints, though their supporters treated them as if they were made of gold leaf and virtue. They were fiery, opinionated, and entirely unsuited for the decorum of an American court. The judge, a fellow by the name of Thayer, who seemed to view the entire proceedings as a personal crusade against the radical menace, treated the defense as if it were an infestation of vermin. It was a clash of cultures. The rigid, old-fashioned, starched-collar authority of Massachusetts versus the loose, loud, and dangerous enthusiasm of the immigrant dream. The world, watching this from across the ocean, decided that the trial was a sham. They saw the evidence, which was, to put it mildly, about as substantial as a fog in a hollow, and they decided that the state was not interested in guilt or innocence. They were interested in an example. They wanted to show the world that, in America, you could have your freedom, provided your ideas didn't cause the bankers to lose any sleep. It was a magnificent, albeit tragic display of xenophobia, fueled by the post-war jitters that had turned the entire nation into a nervous wreck. I remember watching the news reports roll in, day after exhausting day. The protests were a riot of color and noise. I saw headlines from cities I couldn't find on a map, all screaming about the martyrs of Massachusetts. Strikes paralyzed London. Bombs went off in the South American night. Intellectuals in Europe wrote letters that were long enough to serve as New Testaments. And all the while, the two men sat in their cells. I imagine wondering when the world had become so loud on their behalf, and why, despite all that shouting, the door to their cell remained so stubbornly shut. The tragedy of the situation was that the argument became a permanent fixture of our century. It wasn't about the robbery anymore. It wasn't about whether Sacco had pulled the trigger or Vanzetti had driven the car. It was about what it meant to be an American, and whether we were going to be a nation that welcomed the stranger or a nation that viewed him with a pistol in one hand and a deportation order in the other. It was an argument that we were destined to have for the next 100 years, a recurring nightmare of our own making. When the state finally decided that enough was enough and the electric chair was dusted off for its grim appointment, the world did not fall silent. It erupted. The execution did not handle the men as the authorities had hoped. It only turned them into ghosts. You can kill a man, but you cannot kill an idea, at least not with a jolt of electricity. If anything, the state only succeeded in proving the anarchists' point, that the system was indeed a rigged affair, and that the scales of justice were balanced primarily by the weight of public opinion and the prejudice of the man in the robe. I felt a profound sense of weariness as the news of the end filtered through. It was a bleak finale to a year that was supposed to be all about the future. We had our airplanes, we had our movies, and we had our stock market miracles. And yet, here we were, performing the same old tired act of ritual slaughter in the name of order. It was as if we were a civilization that had mastered the heavens only to discover that we were still living in the dirt. The Sacco and Vanzetti case is one of those moments that makes you want to hide under the covers and wait for the century to pass. It is the sort of thing that makes a man realize that the progress we talk about so much is largely a matter of having better equipment for our ancient, ugly habits. We have the telegraph to spread the outrage, the radio to amplify the protests, and the airplane to carry the newspapers, but the underlying impulse, the need to punish the outsider for the crime of being different, remains as fresh as it was in the days of the witch hunts. There was a peculiar, almost whimsical irony in the fact that the authorities thought the execution would put an end to the trouble. They believed that by removing the agitators, they would remove the agitation. It was a fundamental misunderstanding of the human condition. People do not protest because they like the sound of their own voices. They protest because they are worried or angry or hopeful for a better world. You can kill the men, but you only serve to provide the movement with a set of martyrs, which are far more dangerous to a government than living men could ever be. A martyr doesn't have to be fed, doesn't have to be consulted, and doesn't have to worry about the cost of living. He just hangs there, a silent, reproachful image that haunts the conscience of the state forever. As I sat there, reading the accounts of the protests, I realized that the argument was never going to end. It was etched into the bedrock of the 20th century. We are a country of conflicting dreams, and every so often we decide to test the strength of our foundation by throwing a couple of lives into the furnace to see if the building holds. It holds, but it is scorched, and the marks of the fire are there for anyone who cares to look. So the world screamed, the chair hissed, and the two shoemakers vanished into the history books. The ticker tape machine kept on clicking, the stock market kept on rising, and the party of 1927 continued, though perhaps with a slightly sharper, more metallic edge to the music. We had proven that we could be just as ruthless as any king or emperor, and we had done it with the full, noisy, and chaotic consent of the public. It was a sobering lesson, though I suspect most people were too busy dancing the Charleston to notice. If you ever find yourself in Massachusetts, you might want to steer clear of the history books on this particular subject. They are filled with words like guilt, conspiracy, and justice, and they all taste like ashes. The truth, I suspect, is that the system worked exactly the way it always does. It protected its own, it satisfied the prejudices of its time, and it left the rest of us to argue over the bones. It is a grand, messy, and deeply unedifying tale, and it serves as a permanent, grumpy reminder that no matter how high we fly or how fast we talk, we are still very much in need of a little more kindness and a great deal less certainty. Chapter 9. The Bath School Catastrophe. It is a curious and distressing fact that while the human animal is capable of climbing to the very heights of ingenuity, inventing the airplane to conquer the clouds, the radio to command the airwaves, and the talkie to save us from the exertion of reading subtitles, he retains a primitive, subterranean impulse toward malice that no amount of industrial progress can scrub away. We build schools, we fill them with books and eager children, and we convince ourselves that we have created a temple of reason. Then along comes a man with a grudge so small it could fit into a thimble, and he decides to turn that temple into a pile of splinters and sorrow. In the year of 1927, in a quiet corner of Michigan, a man named Kehoe, a school board member no less, which is a position that generally confers a sort of harmless, dusty authority, decided that his personal disappointments were quite enough of a reason to commit the deadliest act of mass murder in our history. It was not a war, not a revolution, not a grand collision of ideologies. It was the singular concentrated malice of one man who had convinced himself that the world owed him a debt, and that the only way to collect was to blow the world to pieces. The Bath School disaster was a chilling reminder that human malice does not require a foreign invasion, a famine, or a plague to find a high body count. It only requires a bit of dynamite, a twisted sense of grievance, and a total terrifying detachment from the humanity of others. We often look for monsters in the shadows or in the ranks of our enemies, but sometimes the monster is sitting in the back row of a school board meeting, nodding at the budget report and thinking about fuses. When the blast went off, it didn't just shake the foundations of a school. It shook the foundations of our collective confidence. We had spent the entire decade telling ourselves that we were moving forward, that we were evolving, that we were leaving the dark, violent impulses of the past behind us. We had our jazz, our gin, our glorious new machines, and our invincible optimism. We were a people who had successfully replaced the mud of the frontier with the asphalt of the city, and we assumed that the violence had been paved over along with the dirt roads. But the violence was still there, lurking in the cracks, waiting for the right moment to erupt. It reminded us, with a blunt, brutal efficiency, that our civilization is a thin veneer, a coat of paint over a very old, very wild, and very unpredictable wood. We can build as many schools as we like, we can hire the finest teachers, and we can install the most modern equipment, but we cannot legislate the darkness out of the human heart. That is a project that remains perpetually unfinished. I found myself pondering, as the newspapers spread the horrific details across the country, why it is that we are so quick to forget such lessons. We are a people who love a clean slate. We want to believe that each day is a new beginning, untainted by the tragedies of the day before. We read about the catastrophe. We shake our heads in righteous horror. We donate to the relief funds. And then a week later, we are back to arguing about the price of wheat or the latest scandal in Hollywood. It is a necessary, if slightly cowardly, form of forgetfulness. If we had to carry the weight of all our sorrows every single day, we would never have the strength to get out of bed. But this particular sorrow was different. It didn't belong to the battlefield. It belonged to the playground. It didn't belong to the criminal underworld. It belonged to the school board. It was a violation of the most sacred pact we have with one another, the agreement that our children are off limits, that the schoolhouse is a sanctuary, and that the future, represented by the rows of desks and the scratched blackboards, is something to be protected, not destroyed. The investigation that followed was a grim, clinical affair, trying to parse out the motives of a man who had left behind nothing but a riddle of resentment. We wanted a reason. We wanted a label. We wanted to be able to say, he did this because he was a radical or a lunatic or a victim of some grand systemic injustice. But there was no grand narrative to be found. There was only a man who had been obsessed with his own importance, a man who felt slighted by a world that didn't pay him the attention he thought he deserved. It was a tragedy of ego, a small-minded explosion that resulted in a monumental loss. The scale of the devastation was such that it defied the usual vocabulary of our newspapers. They used words like fiendish, satanic, and inexplicable, but none of them quite captured the sheer unadulterated absurdity of it. How does one account for a man who spends his days planning the destruction of the very thing he was entrusted to manage? It is a level of irony so dark that it feels like a cosmic joke, played by a god who has a very strange sense of humor. I suspect that the people of Bath, Michigan, will be haunted by that silence long after the bricks have been cleared away. The silence of a school at recess, the silence of a town that has lost its children, the silence of the aftermath, when there are no more questions to be asked. We can rebuild the building, of course. We can hire new teachers, and we can fill the classrooms with a new generation of students. But the memory of that day will remain, a phantom presence in the hallways, a reminder that the world is a fragile place held together by nothing more than our own fragile trust. It is a heavy thing to contemplate in a year that is supposed to be defined by our reach for the stars. We are trying to fly across the Atlantic. We are trying to record the human voice. We are trying to map the heavens. And yet, we are still struggling with the most basic elemental challenge: how to live in peace with one another. We have mastered the physics of the machine, but we have completely failed the psychology of the human being. Perhaps, in the final analysis, that is the true story of 1927. It is not the story of the airplane or the movie or the stock market. It is the story of our ongoing, agonizing, and remarkably slow attempt to be better than we were yesterday. We are a collection of dreamers who are occasionally dragged back to the ground by our own worst impulses. We are a race of people who can build a bridge across a river and a bomb beneath a schoolhouse, all in the same decade. I try to remain optimistic, as I am a writer, and it is part of the job description to believe that the next sentence will be better than the last. But sometimes the silence of the page is interrupted by the echoes of the past, and one has to pause and acknowledge the darkness. We are not quite the civilized creatures we claim to be. We are still, at heart, a bit primitive, a bit prone to tantrums, and a bit too fond of the match. The Bath School catastrophe was a dark, jagged crack in the polished surface of the 20s. It was a reminder that no matter how much we may decorate our lives with the gadgets and glitter of modernity, the old, dark, dangerous realities of the human heart are never more than a few steps away. We can drive the fastest cars, we can hear the most beautiful music, and we can watch the world from the comfort of our living rooms, but we cannot escape the fact that we are all, every single one of us, responsible for the world we share, and sometimes, heaven help us, that responsibility is more than we can bear. So, let us remember the lesson, however painful it may be. Let us remember that the strength of our civilization is not found in our skyscrapers or our assembly lines, but in the trust we place in one another. When that trust is broken, when a man decides that his grievance is worth more than the lives of a school full of children, then the entire edifice of our society begins to tremble. We must be vigilant, not just for the monsters in the dark, but for the bitterness in our own hearts. For as long as we continue to nurture our grudges, we are all, in a sense, standing on a pile of dynamite, waiting for a fuse that someone, somewhere, is already beginning to light. And that, I should think, is a thought that should keep us all awake at night. Chapter 10. The 60-Bomb Summer. In the year of our Lord 1927, there existed in the city of New York a collection of athletic specimens known to the public as the Murderer's Row. It was a moniker that carried a certain delightful and entirely American lack of restraint. One might have expected a baseball team to be named after birds or cities, or perhaps some noble, if entirely fictional, creature of the wild. But no, the Yankees had decided that if you were going to be the most terrifying bunch of fellows to ever step onto a diamond, you might as well adopt a name that suggested you were likely to be apprehended by the constabulary before the third inning. At the center of this hurricane of bats and bravado stood one George Herman Ruth, a man who possessed the build of a retired beer barrel and the heart of a mischievous schoolboy. He was, by any reasonable calculation, a human explosion. When he stepped up to the plate, the entire stadium would fall into a hush so profound that you could hear the grass growing in the outfield. Then, crack! A sound like a lightning strike in a dry forest, and the ball would disappear into the hazy distance, usually followed by the frantic waving of hats and the joyful hysteria of 20,000 people who had paid good money to see a miracle performed by a man who looked like he had just finished his lunch. That summer, the Babe decided to set a record that would make the statisticians weep and the opposers' pitchers consider a career in the much safer and more predictable field of accounting. He hit 60 home runs. 60! It was a number so large, so preposterous, that it felt less like a sporting achievement and more like a mathematical insult to the rest of the league. It turned the game of baseball, which had once been a polite and thoughtful affair of strategy, sacrifice bunts, and tactical daring, into a pure, unadulterated contest of artillery. Baseball had officially become a game of explosions. The strategy of the bunt, that delicate, humble dance of the infield, was relegated to the dustbin of history, to be used only by those who lack the intestinal fortitude to swing for the fences. The managers, poor, harried fellows who spent their lives trying to convince their players that a single was a noble endeavor, were forced to stand on the sidelines and watch as their charges swung for the moon with every pitch. It was, I suspect, a very frustrating time to be a strategist. When the game is reduced to see ball, hit ball, watch ball vanish over the wall, the manager is about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. I attended a game at the stadium during that sweltering, thunderous summer, and I must confess, I have never seen a more gleeful display of human destruction. The fans were in a state of constant, twitchy anticipation. They didn't come to see a game. They came to see a detonation. They were waiting for the Babe to connect, and every time he did, the collective roar was enough to rattle the fillings out of the teeth of every person within a 3-mile radius. It was loud, it was sweaty, and it was glorious in its complete lack of refinement. The pitchers, meanwhile, were a pitiable sight. They would stand on that little mound of dirt, staring at the Babe with the wide, haunted eyes of a deer facing down a steam engine. They knew, as surely as they knew their own names, that they were about to be turned into a footnote in someone else's legend. They would wind up, throw their best, and then watch in dejected silence as the ball soared into the stratosphere, leaving behind nothing but the sad, lonely sound of a catcher's glove snapping shut on empty air. It was a humiliating profession, being a pitcher in 1927. You spent your life practicing the art of the curve, the speed of the slider, and the placement of the pitch, only to have it all rendered utterly moot by a fellow who swung with the casual indifference of a man swatting a bothersome fly. One wonders, in the cold light of the morning, what all this fervor signifies. Is it progress to make the game simpler? Is it advancement to remove the subtlety and replace it with brute force? Perhaps. We are a nation that has always had a soft spot for the big, the loud, and the impressive. We like our cars fast, our buildings tall, and our home runs long. We want to be amazed, we want to be startled, and we want to be able to tell our grandchildren that we were there when the ball disappeared into the ether. The Murderers' Row, as they were called, were not just a baseball team. They were a symbol of the age. They were big, they were confident, and they were, for all intents and purposes, unstoppable. They played with a sense of inevitability that is usually reserved for the tides or the changing of the seasons. They would walk out onto the field, look across at the trembling opposition, and essentially announced that they had come to take the afternoon off and maybe shatter a few records while they were at it. I imagine the opposing managers sitting in their dugouts and trying to think of some crafty, devious way to stop the carnage, eventually gave up and just started reading the newspaper. What is the use in planning when the other side has a titan who can knock the cover off the ball by sheer brute will? It's like trying to stop an avalanche with a handheld fan. You might feel very industrious, but you aren't going to change the outcome of the afternoon. And so, the pitchers of the American League began to look for an exit. They realized that they were participating in a sport that had fundamentally changed beneath their feet. They were the last practitioners of the old, subtle, tactical baseball, and they were being swept away by the new, roaring, explosive version of the game. They were the silent film stars of the baseball diamond. And the Babe was the first talking picture. He didn't just win, he redefined the terms of the argument. Yet, despite the lopsided nature of the results, there was a strange, undeniable beauty in the spectacle. There was a rhythm to it. The pitch's wind-up, the swing, the contact, the sound, and the flight. It was a performance that followed its own internal logic. It was a spectacle of human capacity, a testament to what a man could do if he simply stopped worrying about the rules of the game and started focusing on the sheer physical joy of smashing a ball into the next county. When the 60th ball finally cleared the fence, the roar of the crowd was not just for the record, it was for the feeling of relief. The tension of the summer, the building, escalating, grinding pressure of the hunt for the record had finally reached its crescendo. We had done it. We had stretched the record, we had tested the limits, and we had come out the other side with a number that would stand as a monument for decades to come. It was a summer of home runs, a summer of explosions, a summer that proved once and for all that we are a nation that is happiest when we are swinging for the fences. The game has changed, of course. Baseball today is a different beast, more calculated, more analyzed, and more obsessed with data than a frantic tax collector. But back then, in that hazy, sweltering, golden 1927, it was just a game of explosions. And for a few fleeting months, it felt like the most important thing in the world. We are a nation of fans, always looking for a hero who can swing the bat, throw the pass, or steer the plane. We want to believe that there are people among us who can do the impossible, who can make the ball dance, who can turn the impossible into the routine. We want to believe in the Babe, in the Murderers' Row, and in the idea that if we just hold our breath and wait, we might see something that will make the rest of the world seem, for one glorious moment, a little bit more interesting. As the season drew to a close and the leaves began to turn in the orchards outside of New York, the ghost of that summer hung in the air. The pitchers finally got some sleep, the managers finally got to play their tactical games, and the ticker-tape machines went back to their usual monotonous rhythm. But for those who were there, those who saw the ball rise into the sun, those who heard the roar, and those who felt the earth shake under the weight of the triumph, it was a memory that would last as long as the game itself. It was the summer the game broke, and we loved every glorious, messy, explosive minute of it. Chapter 11, the 14-second intermission. It is a singular misfortune of the human race that we cannot simply settle our differences with a polite game of chess or a spirited debate over the relative merits of various brands of tobacco. No, we must insist upon gathering in large, noisy arenas to watch two fellows in leather shorts attempt to separate one another from their senses. In the year of 1927, the pinnacle of this peculiar human urge was the heavyweight championship fight between Gene Tunney and Jack Dempsey, held at Soldier Field in Chicago. It was a spectacle that drew the largest crowd and the deepest coffers of the decade, proving once and for all that if you promise a man a bit of blood and a glimpse of the absolute limits of human endurance, he will travel through sleet, snow, or the most appalling traffic to get a front-row seat. Jack Dempsey was the Manasseh Mauler, a name that sounded like it had been scraped off the side of a jagged cliff. He was a force of nature, a scrapper who didn't so much fight as he did dismantle his opponent with the grim, methodical intensity of a man trying to finish a very difficult repair job. Gene Tunney, by contrast, was a fellow who liked to read books, wear tailored suits, and speak in complete sentences, a combination of traits that made him highly suspect in the eyes of the average fight fan, who preferred their champions to look like they had been raised by wolves and fed on a diet of raw nails. The fight itself was a masterclass in the unexpected. For several rounds, Tunney danced and jabbed, treating the ring as if it were a ballroom, and Dempsey as if he were a particularly aggressive partner who had forgotten his steps. But then, in the seventh round, the Mauler did what he was famous for. He connected with a blow that had enough steam behind it to power a small locomotive. Tunney went down, and for a moment it seemed as if the world had suddenly grown quiet, the way a forest does before a landslide. But here's where the comedy and the controversy, that most delicious of all human seasonings, entered the fray. According to the rules, which are the only thing separating us from the apes, when a man goes down, his opponent must immediately retreat to a neutral corner to allow the referee to perform the count. Dempsey, whether due to the heat of the moment, a temporary lapse in his internal clock, or a lingering fondness for the old lawless days of the prize ring, stood there for a few seconds like a predator, waiting for the prey to decide if it was finished. Those few seconds, which stretched out into an eternity of silence and held breaths, allowed Tunney the time he needed to remember his own name, to count his fingers, and to get back on his feet. They called it the long count, and for the next 50 years, or perhaps even a century should the argument continue to have legs, it would be the favorite topic of every barroom, barbershop, and porch-side conversation in America. Was it a fair count? Did the referee lose his place in the book of arithmetic? Did Dempsey give the victory away by refusing to step back? It was a beautiful, insoluble mystery. It had all the necessary components of a great American myth: a hero, a villain, a moment of high drama, and a conclusion that left everyone involved absolutely certain that they were the only ones who actually understood what had happened. Watching it unfold, I couldn't help but marvel at the absurdity of it all. We have built these magnificent stadiums, we have developed these precise rules, and we have hired the most serious men in the business to officiate. And yet, the entire thing collapses into a debate over whether a man stood in the wrong corner for a handful of seconds. It is the perfect metaphor for our national character. We are a people who love the structure of the law, but we are also a people who would much rather argue about the interpretation of the law than actually abide by it. Dempsey, I suspect, was a man who lived by the ancient unspoken code of the ring, the code that says you don't stop until the other fellow stops moving. Tunney, on the other hand, was the representative of the modern refined age, a man who understood that even in a fight there is a rhythm to the rules. By not going to the neutral corner, Dempsey hadn't just made a tactical error. He had committed a social gaffe. He had failed to respect the choreography of the event. And in the eyes of the modern spectator, a man who fails to respect the choreography is a man who doesn't deserve the prize. It was a fascinating study in the evolution of our collective conscience. We want our fights to be real, but we don't want them to be too real. We want the violence, but we want it contained within the neat, orderly confines of a ring, overseen by a man with a stopwatch and a sense of propriety. We want the thrill of the savage, provided it is being performed by a man who understands that he is playing a part in a grand public production. Tunney won the fight, of course, and went on to cement his reputation as the Fighting Marine, a title that sounded quite grand, even if he did spend a fair bit of his time in the ring running away from Dempsey's fists. But the victory felt like an afterthought. The real story was the pause. It was the 14-second intermission that had redefined the nature of the sport. It was the moment when the law, the chaos, and the sheer physical reality of two men trying to destroy each other collided and produced a piece of theater that would outlast the fighters themselves. I recall sitting in a cafe a few days later and listening to two men argue about the count until their faces turned the color of overripe beets. They weren't fighting about a sporting result anymore. They were fighting about the nature of fairness, about the sanctity of the rules, and about who, in the final analysis, was the better man. One insisted that Dempsey had been robbed by the referee's incompetence. The other insisted that Tunney had won by the sheer intellectual superiority of his strategy. They were having the exact same argument that people have been having since the dawn of time, only with a little more passion and a lot more beer. It is a wonderful thing, the long count. It is a reminder that even when we think we have mastered the world with our machines and our rules, we are still prone to the unpredictable, the irrational, and the perfectly, wonderfully flawed. We are a species that will argue for half a century about a few seconds in a ring in Chicago, and we will do it with the same fervor that we reserve for politics, religion, and the question of whether a hot dog is truly a sandwich. Perhaps that is the secret of our longevity. We love the debate almost as much as we love the event. We love the uncertainty, the possibility of a mistake, and the chance to prove that we were right all along. And if, in the process, we have to endure a few years of yelling at our neighbors, well, that is a small price to pay for the satisfaction of being the keeper of the true version of history. As for the fighters themselves, they eventually faded into the shadows of the past, as all heroes must. Dempsey became a legend, a relic of a time when fighting was a life-or-death occupation, and Tunney became a gentleman of letters, a man who preferred the company of Shakespeare to the company of bruised ribs. But the long count remains. It is a permanent fixture in the American attic, a story that we bring out every so often to remind ourselves that even the most carefully orchestrated spectacles are subject to the whim of a moment, the hesitation of a man, and the stubbornness of a referee who has lost his watch. It is a lesson worth holding on to, I think, as we continue to charge forward into this noisy, modern century. No matter how many rules we write, no matter how many stadiums we build, and no matter how many referees we hire, there will always be a moment where the world stops, where the rules seem to vanish, and where we are left to wonder what just happened. And in those moments, we are left with nothing but our own interpretations, our own arguments, and our own unique and deeply flawed sense of justice. It's a messy way to go about things, but I wouldn't have it any other way. It keeps the conversations interesting, and it ensures that as long as there is a man in a ring and a watch in a pocket, we will never, ever be short of something to argue about. And in the final analysis, isn't that what the American dream is all about? The right to be wrong, the right to shout about it, and the right to insist, until the day we die, that if only the referee had been paying attention, the whole world would be a much, much different place. Chapter 12. The Carving of the Sacred Hills. It has often occurred to me that humanity is never quite so satisfied as when it is taking a perfectly good, perfectly natural, and perfectly indifferent mountain and deciding that what it truly needs is a face. Not just any face, mind you, but a face of such monumental proportions that it can be seen from the moon, provided the man on the moon has a very good telescope and a fair amount of curiosity. In the year 1927, we arrived at that precise point of industrial hubris where we looked at the Black Hills of South Dakota, a range of mountains that had spent a few million years minding its own business, and concluded that it would be a delightful idea to blow the top off and carve the visages of 4 of our presidents into the solid granite. The man tasked with this geologic blasphemy was a sculptor named Gutzon Borglum, a fellow who clearly felt that the Renaissance masters had been far too timid in their choice of medium. Why bother with marble in a gallery when you can use dynamite on a mountain in the middle of nowhere? It was a project that perfectly captured the spirit of the age. We were no longer content to simply admire the world. We felt an irresistible urge to put our stamp on it, to ensure that if the earth itself were ever to crack open, it would do so in the shape of a presidential portrait. To watch the early stages of this work was to witness a scene that would have made a mountain goat weep with terror. There were men hanging from ropes like marionettes in a gale, dangling thousands of feet above the valley floor, armed with nothing but jackhammers, drill bits, and a reckless disregard for the fundamental principles of gravity. They would drill holes, pack them with charges, and then, kaboom! A few tons of prehistoric granite would go tumbling down the mountainside, taking with it the natural contours of the hill and replacing them with the somewhat stern and increasingly recognizable jawline of Mr. Washington. It is a curious sort of patriotism that requires the defacement of a mountain. One has to wonder what the founders themselves would have thought of the matter. I suspect Mr. Jefferson, a man who possessed a quiet, contemplative temperament, would have been deeply unsettled to find his nose being sculpted by a man with a penchant for high explosives. But we are a nation that likes its heroes to be big, and in this case, we decided that the only way to ensure they would never be forgotten was to turn them into a geological feature. It is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And if there is one thing we Americans love, it is permanence. We build our banks out of stone, our promises out of concrete, and our heroes out of cliffs. The sheer staggering cost of the endeavor was, of course, the least of our concerns. In a year when the stock market was doing the jitterbug and everyone was convinced that we had discovered the secret to infinite wealth, who cares about a few $1,000,000? Money was just a number on a ticker tape. And why keep it in the bank when you could use it to blast the face of a president into a mountainside? It was a grand, whimsical, and utterly expensive way to express our collective admiration. We weren't just building a monument. We were building a billboard for the ages. But consider the mountain's perspective for a moment. It had been sitting there, gathering snow, harboring pine trees, and watching the bison wander by for eons. It was a mountain. It was proud. It was jagged. And it was entirely content to be a mountain. Then along comes Mr. Borglum and his crew of dynamite-happy artists. And suddenly, it's forced to wear the expression of a disappointed schoolmaster for the rest of its geological existence. I suspect that if mountains had feelings, this one would have been feeling quite put upon. And yet, there is something undeniably captivating about the endeavor. We are a species that is obsessed with leaving our mark, with shouting into the wind, with saying, "I was here and I had the power to change the shape of the world." We look at the silence of the wilderness, and we feel an urgent need to fill it with our own voices, our own images, and our own monumental ego. We cannot stand the idea that the earth will eventually reclaim everything we build. We want to construct things that are so massive, so stubborn, and so hard-headed that nature herself will be forced to accommodate us. It is, perhaps, the most American of traits. We are not a people who are satisfied with the world as we find it. We are a people who want to rearrange the furniture, paint the walls, and, if the mood strikes us, carve our ancestors into the architecture of the continent. We don't just want to inhabit the land. We want to own it, to tame it, and to turn it into a reflection of our own aspirations. And what better way to do that than by turning a mountain into a hall of fame? The work moved slowly, as slow as a glacier, but with a great deal more noise and a lot less dignity. Every day the sound of the dynamite echoed through the hills, a constant rhythmic reminder that we were hard at work transforming the natural into the man-made. The dust would rise, the rock would fall, and slowly the features would emerge, etched into the stubborn face of the granite. It was a long, dusty, and remarkably hazardous process, but the people of South Dakota, and indeed the nation at large, watched with a sense of pride that was as big as the mountain itself. There was also a bit of the macabre in it, if you stop to think about the logistics. Think of the poor fellow whose job it was to trim the eyebrows of a president. One wrong slip, one extra pound of dynamite, and you've given Mr. Lincoln a permanent frown or accidentally lopped off the ear of a founding father. It was a high-stakes game of stone carving, a sort of artistic Russian roulette where the penalty for a mistake was the permanent comical alteration of our national iconography. I suspect that when the work is finally finished, a task that will take years of sweat and stone dust, we will look up at those faces and feel a sense of triumph. We will have beaten the mountain into submission. We will have forced the landscape to pay homage to our history. We will have successfully asserted that our ideas, our leaders, and our ambitions are bigger than the natural world itself. But I cannot help but wonder if, in the distant future, when the dynamite has long since been forgotten and the ticker-tape machines have long since ceased their clatter, someone will come along, look up at those stone faces, and wonder what sort of people we were. We, who had the whole world to explore, who had the freedom to live in the quietude of the forest or the beauty of the plain, chose instead to turn the mountains into a gallery. We were a people who were so obsessed with ourselves, so convinced of our own importance, that we decided that the best way to honor our past was to literally reshape the future in our own stone-cold image. It is a monumental vanity, but it is a vanity that is entirely, vibrantly, and uniquely ours. We are a people who do not know how to be small. We are a people who do not know how to be silent. We are a people who must always be building, always be carving, and always be asserting our presence, even on the side of a mountain that would much rather be left alone. So, let them carve. Let the dust fly and the dynamite roar. Let the faces of the presidents emerge from the granite, staring out across the plains at a nation that is constantly changing, constantly moving, and constantly searching for the next thing to reshape. It is a grand, whimsical, and spectacularly ridiculous project, and as I sit here and contemplate the scale of it, I find myself laughing. We are truly a remarkable set of creatures. We have carved our history into the very bones of the continent, and we are perfectly convinced that we have done a fine, noble, and altogether necessary thing. And honestly, who am I to argue? If you have the dynamite, why not use it? The mountains have been around for a long time, and I suppose it's only fair that they learn at last how to be a bit more patriotic. Chapter 13. The Shanghai Slaughter. In the spring of 1927, the map of China was a document being held by two different men who were both trying to rip it in half, while simultaneously claiming they were the only ones who knew how to fold it properly. For a time, the nationalists, led by the ever-determined, ever-starchy Chiang Kai-shek, had been waltzing through the country in a grand alliance with the communists. It was a partnership of convenience that possessed all the genuine warmth and lasting potential of a marriage between a hungry cat and a very nervous canary. They had marched together, fought together, and shared the same tea, all while eyeing each other across the table with the sort of suspicion that usually precedes a very messy divorce. In Shanghai, that glittering, humid, and remarkably complicated port city, where the world seemed to collide in a spectacular pileup of commerce and contradiction, the alliance finally reached its breaking point. Chiang Kai-shek, a man who possessed a sense of political timing that would have made a professional gambler look like a timid schoolgirl, decided that his communist comrades had outlived their usefulness. He had come to the realization that it is remarkably difficult to be the sole master of a country when you have a pack of ideological enthusiasts constantly looking over your shoulder and suggesting that perhaps the peasants should own the factories. And so, with a suddenness that startled the diplomats, the merchants, and, most especially, the communists, Chiang decided to solve his staffing problem with the efficiency of a machine gun. He turned his forces, which had been perfectly happy to fight the warlords only a few days prior, upon his former allies in a purge that was as systematic as it was bloody. It was a turning point, a moment when the history of China stopped being a debate and started being a funeral. To witness such an event from the comfort of the West is to be struck by the sheer, cold-blooded efficiency of human ambition. The city of Shanghai, with its high society clubs, its bustling docks, and its atmosphere of infinite intrigue, was suddenly transformed into a hunting ground. The machine guns chattered in the alleys, the streets ran with the frantic energy of the pursued, and the map-makers of the world suddenly found themselves with a great deal of overtime work. China had been split down the middle, and the resulting fracture was not a hairline crack. It was a chasm that would keep the world's diplomats, soldiers, and historians busy for the next several decades. There is a grim, dark humor to the way we manage our revolutions. We speak of alliances and unity with all the solemnity of a preacher, yet at the first sign of a disagreement, we reach for the lead and the gunpowder. Chiang Kai-shek was a man who wanted to build a nation, but he wanted to build it in his own image, and that image did not include room for anyone who had a different idea about how the pie should be sliced. It is the perennial tragedy of the strong man. He is so convinced that he alone holds the key to the future that he is willing to burn the house down to prove it. The rest of the world watched this unfold from the safety of the international settlements, nursing their gins and scratching their heads in bewilderment. They had spent years trying to figure out who was who and what was what in the Chinese political theater, and just when they thought they had the program memorized, the actors decided to switch the script for a tragedy. It was a reminder that in the grand game of nations, your friends are only your friends until they decide that you are an obstacle to their own private version of progress. One cannot help but marvel at the arrogance of it all. We have these grand, sweeping ideas, nationalism, communism, democracy, imperialism, and we treat them as if they are holy relics, worthy of any sacrifice. And yet, when you peel back the layers of the ideology, what do you find? You find men. Men with egos, men with ambitions, men who are frightened of being second best, and men who would rather see a city burn than admit they might be wrong. It is a very human, very small, and very destructive way to run a planet. The slaughter in Shanghai was the end of an illusion, the illusion that China could be unified without a fight, that the past could be reconciled with the future, and that the various factions could find a way to live in the same house. Chiang Kai-shek had decided that the house had to be cleared out, and he was not going to be particularly polite about the process. He had chosen his path, he had chosen his enemies, and he had chosen the language of force to ensure that no one would be left to argue with his decision. As the smoke began to clear, it became apparent that the map was no longer a flat, simple thing. It was now a contested space, a land of divided loyalties and hidden agendas. The communists, having been purged from the cities, began their long, arduous trek into the countryside, where they would learn to speak the language of the earth and the farmer, a shift that would eventually lead to a revolution far more profound and far more permanent than anything the urban power brokers could have imagined. Chiang, meanwhile, set about building his capital in Nanjing, a city that was as much a symbol of his authority as it was a challenge to the world. It is a strange and sad story, a tale of fractured dreams and spilled ink and blood. We tell ourselves that we are building the world anew, that we are clearing the brush to plant a garden of progress, but we always seem to forget that the soil is soaked in the mistakes of the past. We act as if we are the first ones to discover the secret of power, and we ignore the thousands of years of wreckage that lie beneath our feet. We are a forgetful race, a race of optimists who are constantly surprised when the fire we started ends up burning our own fingers. I suspect that the people of Shanghai, in the quiet, reflective years that followed, must have looked back at those days and wondered if it all had to be so complicated. But that is the nature of the beast, isn't it? We crave the simplicity of the solution, but we are plagued by the complexity of the problem. We want to be the ones who finally get it right, and we are willing to risk everything to see if we can do it. And when we fail, and we always fail, we simply look for someone else to blame and start the process all over again. In 1927, the world was becoming a smaller, noisier, and more interconnected place, and that meant that a massacre in Shanghai was not just a local event. It was a global vibration. It sent a shockwave through the halls of power in London, Washington, and Moscow. Everyone had a stake, everyone had an opinion, and everyone was terrified that the situation would get out of hand. But it had already gotten out of hand. It had gotten out of hand the moment we decided that we could control the fate of a country of hundreds of millions by simply rearranging the people at the top of the pile. It is a ridiculous, grand, and utterly tragic vanity. And yet, as I look back at the maps and the headlines, I can't help but feel a strange, hollow respect for the sheer, relentless, and stubborn energy of the human will. We are a race that refuses to stay put. We are a race that refuses to accept the world as it is. We are a race that insists on rewriting the script, even when the stage is on fire and the audience has already left the building. So Chiang Kai-shek took his gamble, the communists took to the hills, and the world settled in to watch the next act of a play that seemed destined to last for 100 years. We were all passengers on a ship that had just hit an iceberg, and instead of repairing the hull, we were busy arguing over who got the biggest slice of the lifeboats. It's a very modern, very human, and very disastrous way to behave, and I suppose that is exactly why it is so interesting. We are always doing the most incredible, the most foolish, and the most irreversible things, and we do them with the solemn conviction that we are doing something of great historical significance. And perhaps we are. But one does wish, just once in a while, that we could settle our arguments with a bit less lid and a bit more sense. But then again, if we had any sense, we probably wouldn't be human, would we? We'd be something far more sensible, far less exciting, and infinitely more boring, and heaven forbid we ever become that. Chapter 14, The Cosmic Egg, The Big Bang Prequel. In the year of our Lord 1927, while the rest of the world was busy worrying about the stock market, the price of gasoline, or whether Al Jolson was going to sing another song about his mother, a Belgian priest by the name of Georges Lemaitre was staring at the heavens and concluding that the entire universe was, in its infancy, nothing more than a very small, very dense, and presumably quite frustrated egg. Now, most people, when they look at the night sky, see a vast, comforting expanse of velvet draped in diamond dust, a celestial ceiling installed for the sole purpose of making us feel small and romantic. Father Lemaitre, however, looked at the same sky and saw a balloon that had been blown up too quickly. He proposed, with the calm demeanor of a man suggesting a minor adjustment to the church picnic menu, that the universe was expanding, not merely shifting, mind you, or rearranging its furniture, but stretching, outward, ever outward, like a piece of taffy being pulled by a giant with nothing better to do. This was a profoundly uncomfortable suggestion. The scientific community of the time, a group of gentlemen who were generally quite fond of their universe being a stable, reliable, and well-behaved place, was deeply offended. They preferred to think of the cosmos as a proper, dignified butler who had always been standing there, tray in hand, ready to serve the next event. The idea that the universe had a beginning, a moment when it was packed into a single, primordial atom, smacked entirely too much of theology. It was, they felt, an amateurish attempt to turn physics into a Sunday school lesson. And yet, there was the math. Oh, do not worry, I shall not bore you with the squiggles and the signs. But there it was, lurking in the background like a stubborn stain on a pristine carpet. The equation suggested that if you ran the clock backward, everything we see, everything we touch, and everything we have ever argued about would eventually shrink down into a point so tiny it could dance on the head of a pin, provided the pin was made of extremely sturdy material. I find this notion utterly delightful, if only for its sheer unmitigated gall. We are such proud creatures. We have our empires, our ticker-tape machines, our skyscrapers, and our debates over the nature of history. And here comes a priest-physicist to tell us that we are all at our core just a tiny, compressed bit of leftover scrambled egg. It is a humbling thought, though I suspect most of us would prefer to believe that we were created out of something a bit more dignified, like stardust or pure, refined intellect. But the primordial atom does not care for our dignity. It only cares for the laws of physics, and those laws are notoriously indifferent to our feelings. The scientific community spent a great deal of time and a staggering amount of ink trying to poke holes in Father Lemaitre's theory. They called it the Big Bang, a name that was intended to be a joke, a sarcastic, mocking title for a theory they were certain would be laughed out of the laboratory by the following Tuesday. But, as it turns out, the universe has a very dry sense of humor. The name stuck. It is now the standard moniker for the most monumental event in the history of everything, a title that manages to sound both like a comic book explosion and a profound cosmic truth. I imagine Father Lemaitre sitting in his study, surrounded by the quiet ticking of a clock and the smell of old paper, calmly observing the commotion his cosmic egg had caused. He was a man who understood that there was no conflict between the truth of the spirit and the truth of the equation. To him, the fact that the universe was born in a flash of light was simply a way of describing the miracle of existence in a language that the stars could understand. But for the rest of us, we were still struggling with the fact that we were currently living on a rock that was hurtling through an infinite void at a speed that would make a race car driver faint from vertigo. The idea that the void itself was growing, that the distances between the stars were increasing, was simply too much to swallow. We wanted the universe to be a house, not a balloon. We wanted the walls to stay put. We wanted to know where the kitchen was, and we certainly didn't want to be told that the kitchen was currently moving away from the living room at a rate that defied all common sense. The resistance to this idea was a masterpiece of human stubbornness. We have a desperate need for a static world. We want things to be permanent. We want to believe that the map we drew yesterday will still be accurate tomorrow. When someone comes along and suggests that the very ground of reality is fluid, that the universe is not a museum piece, but a living, changing, stretching, breathing entity, we react with the frantic defensiveness of a man who has just been told that his house is currently being relocated to the next county. I suspect that the Big Bang will be the defining story of the 20th century. It is a story that fits perfectly with our era of restlessness. We are always moving, always expanding, always blowing ourselves up into something bigger and louder. We are a collection of cosmic fragments, still vibrating from the initial shock of our own creation. We don't like to be still, and we don't like to be contained. We want to reach the edges, and if the edges keep moving away from us, well, we shall simply build a faster ship and chase them down. But there is a melancholy to it, too. If the universe is expanding, it means that everything we love, the stars, the galaxies, the memories of our ancestors, is drifting apart. We are all becoming lonelier, in a way. The universe is becoming a vast, empty gallery where the paintings are being spaced further and further apart until eventually there will be nothing left but the silence of the distance. It is a haunting image, one that would make even the most hardened materialist look up at the night sky and feel a sudden, sharp pang of homesickness for a time when everything was in one place. Still, there is a strange comfort in the idea that it all started with an egg. An egg is full of potential. An egg is the promise of something more. An egg is the moment before the chaos breaks loose and becomes life. Perhaps we haven't lost that primordial energy. Perhaps we are still, in our own small, frantic way, in the process of cracking. We are still spilling out into the void, still growing, still trying to fill the space that has been allotted to us. The scientific community eventually came around, of course. They always do. Once the evidence becomes so overwhelming that even the most stubborn professor can no longer ignore it, they simply rename their skepticism prudence and embrace the new truth with the same fervor they used to reject it. It is a very orderly way to handle the collapse of one's worldview. It keeps the departments happy and the lecture halls full. But for me, in this year of 1927, the cosmic egg remains a whimsical, delightful, and utterly mind-boggling concept. I think of the universe as it was. All that sound, all that fury, all that potential, packed into a space smaller than a mustard seed. It is the ultimate magic trick. It is the greatest disappearing act of all time. And we, the audience, are still sitting in our seats, watching the curtain rise, watching the light spread, and trying to remember if we were ever truly that small. I wonder what Father Lemaitre thinks of our own smaller, more localized explosions. He looks at the stars and sees the grand, majestic, and terrifying expansion of the cosmos. We look at our cities and our stock markets and see the same frantic, chaotic, and uncontrollable growth. Perhaps we are just reenacting the Big Bang on a smaller, more human scale. Perhaps every time we start a war, build a city, or invent a new machine, we are just trying to reclaim a bit of that original explosive energy. We are children of the atom, after all, and we have a very hard time sitting still. As the decade continues to roar, I shall keep my eyes on the sky and my feet on the ground. I shall think of the egg, and I shall smile at the absurdity of it all. We are living in a universe that was born in a fit of sudden, unprovoked, and glorious spontaneity. And we are doing our best to live up to the example. We are loud, we are bright, we are expanding, and we are quite possibly drifting toward a finale that we are far too busy to worry about. But that is the way of the world. The egg has cracked, the light has spread, and here we are, caught in the middle of the most interesting show in history. I, for one, wouldn't dream of missing the next act, even if I have to hang on for dear life while the whole thing stretches into the great, beckoning, and perfectly terrifying unknown. Chapter 15. The Birth of the Academy. Wings takes flight. In the year of our Lord 1927, the denizens of Los Angeles, a city that had recently transformed itself from a dusty collection of orange groves into the beating, sweating heart of the world's imagination, decided that they were far too important to be considered mere show people. They had grown tired of being thought of as simple carnival barkers or the purveyors of cheap, flickering dreams. No, they wanted legitimacy. They wanted to be recognized as artists, as scholars, as the high priests of a new global religion. And so, in the grand, opulent tradition of people with far more money than sense, they decided to form an academy. It was a private banquet held in the sort of gilded hotel ballroom where the carpets are thick enough to swallow a man's pride and the chandeliers are large enough to serve as lifeboats, that the International Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences was born. They sat around tables laden with enough silver and crystal to start a revolution, and they drank toasts to the nobility of the craft. It was, in short, a gathering of the self-congratulatory for the purpose of self-perpetuation. The primary object of this esteemed body, as one might suspect, was not to raise the standards of art, but to raise the stakes of their own importance. They decided, quite unilaterally, that the best way to prove that making movies was a high-minded artistic endeavor was to hand out little gold statues to one another. It is a brilliant, if entirely transparent, psychological gambit. If you give a man a trinket, he will feel important. If you give him a trinket and tell him it represents his contribution to the advancement of the art, he will feel like a genius. I have spent a fair amount of time observing the manners and customs of the human species, and I have found that whenever you gather a group of people together and tell them they are Academy members, their heads inevitably begin to swell at a rate that is frankly dangerous to their health. The vanity of the Hollywood set is a potent, concentrated substance, a sort of high-octane ego fuel that keeps the town running long after the rest of us have gone to bed. By creating the Academy, they had essentially institutionalized the backslap. They had turned the Mutual Admiration Society into a formal, chartered, and remarkably pompous organization. But let us be fair. The movies themselves were beginning to show a certain undeniable and rather surprising maturity. Take, for instance, a film released that year called Wings. It was a war picture, because heaven knows we hadn't quite had enough of those, but it was a war picture with a difference. It had airplanes. It had dogfights that made the audience hold their breath, and it had a sense of scale that made the screen feel as if it were about to burst from the sheer effort of holding all that sky. It was a spectacle of the highest order, a film that used the new language of the camera to tell a story that felt as large, as loud, and as terrifying as the world itself. When the Academy looked at Wings, they saw not just a movie, but a justification for their own existence. Here was a film that had cost a fortune, involved a staggering amount of technical labor, and left audiences trembling in their seats. It was the perfect proof that motion pictures were not just a carnival trick. They were an industry, a pillar of the economy, and a medium capable of producing works of monumental, if slightly noisy, significance. They chose wings as their champion, the first recipient of their highest honor, and in doing so, they signaled to the world that they were finally ready to be taken seriously. It is a curious thing, this transition from the carnival to the cathedral. We started by showing people pictures of trains coming at them, a stunt that, in my opinion, still holds up as the single most effective way to clear a room, and we ended by constructing a temple dedicated to the art and science of the image. We are a people who love to categorize, to formalize, and to bureaucratize the things we enjoy. We want our entertainment to be serious. We want our fun to be prestigious. We want to be able to say, I am not just watching a movie. I am participating in a cultural event. As I read about the formation of this academy, I couldn't help but smile at the thought of the chaos that would surely follow. Giving out prizes is, as any school teacher can tell you, a recipe for resentment. You can make one person happy and 1,000 people envious with the stroke of a pen. But the Academy didn't care about that. They knew that the envy was part of the fun. The prestige of the award would be defined by who didn't get it, just as much as by who did. It was a perfect, self-sustaining machine of conflict, a device for ensuring that the people of Hollywood would always have something to argue, plot, and scheme about. I imagine the founders of the Academy standing there in their tuxedos, the smell of expensive cologne and cheap champagne hanging heavy in the air, convinced that they were building something that would last for the ages. They believed they were writing the history of the 20th century in gold, one statue at a time. And in a sense they were. They were creating the mythology of the modern world. They were deciding which stories were worth telling, which actors were worth worshiping, and which movies were worth remembering. They were, to a very large extent, the arbiters of our collective dreams. There is a whimsical sort of nobility in that, even if it is built on a foundation of pure, unadulterated hubris. We have always needed our storytellers, our poets, and our dreamers. And if we have chosen to dress them up in tuxedos, put them in ballrooms, and give them gold statues, well, that is just the way of the world. We love our pageantry. We love our rituals. We love the idea that someone, somewhere, is keeping score. But as I look back at that year, that golden, feverish, and spectacularly self-important 1927, I find myself wondering about the stories we didn't tell. I wonder about the quiet movies that never made it to the banquet hall, the stories that didn't have the airplanes or the dogfights or the massive budgets. I wonder if, in our race to become an art form, we didn't accidentally leave behind some of the humanity that made the movies so wonderful in the first place. The Academy was born in a storm of ambition, and it would spend the next century navigating the currents of public opinion, financial desperation, and the occasional, fleeting flicker of actual, honest-to-goodness genius. It would become the most prestigious, the most mocked, the most debated, and the most watched organization in the history of the medium. It would become a mirror of the world, showing us our best, our worst, and our most dazzlingly complicated selves. So, here is to the Academy. Here is to the gold statues that wait for the winners, and here is to the bitter, disappointed silence that greets the losers. Here is to the banquets, the speeches, the gowns, and the relentless, suffocating, and entirely delightful vanity of it all. We are a people who love to put ourselves on a pedestal, and there is no pedestal quite so high, quite so shiny, and quite so gilded as the one we have built in Hollywood. As the Academy began its long, noisy journey toward immortality, the rest of the world looked on with the fascination of a person watching a house being built on a cliff's edge. They knew it wouldn't last, they knew it would be prone to erosion, and they knew it would eventually fall, but they couldn't help but want to see the view from the top. And in 1927, the view was spectacular. We had the talkies, we had the heroes, we had the mountains being carved into portraits, and we had an academy to tell us who was winning the race. We were, for a brief, breathless moment, the masters of the screen, the kings of the image, and the architects of our own glittering and perfectly manufactured reality. And honestly, if you're going to be a dreamer, you might as well dream in color, with a full orchestra and a gold statue waiting at the end of the script. It's a ridiculous, messy, and entirely American way to live. And I suppose, as long as the popcorn is hot, I wouldn't have it any other way. Chapter 16. Kool-Aid and the Powdered Smile. In the grand, bustling laboratory of the American imagination, a place fueled less by beakers and Bunsen burners and more by a persistent, gnawing desire to get rich quick, there occurred in the year 1927 a development of such profound insignificance that it was destined to change the contents of every pantry in the nation. In the flat, expansive, and perpetually sunny state of Nebraska, a fellow named Edwin Perkins, a man who possessed the heart of a tinkerer and the soul of a magician, managed to pull off the ultimate sleight of hand. He took the liquid out of a fruit drink. Now, to the uninitiated, this might seem like a task akin to removing the wetness from a puddle, but Mr. Perkins saw the future in a desiccated smudge of flavored crystals. He called his discovery Kool-Aid, a name that has the crisp, efficient ring of a commercial empire waiting to be born. It was simple, it was colorful, and it was, most importantly, cheap. For the princely sum of 5 cents, any child with a handful of loose change could transform a pitcher of perfectly respectable, if entirely dull tap water, into a sugary, neon-colored science experiment that tasted vaguely of cherries, grapes, or a chemical approximation of sunshine. It is a marvel, really, the way we handle our liquids in this country. We are a people who have a profound distrust of plain water. We find it too honest, too transparent, too lacking in the necessary kick of artificiality. We want our refreshment to be vibrant. We want it to be shocking. We want to be able to look at a glass of something and wonder, for just a fleeting second, if we haven't accidentally poured a portion of a rainbow into the carafe. And Mr. Perkins, the visionary of the plains, understood this primal urge better than any scientist in a lab coat ever could. The sudden, sweeping popularity of this colorful powder was nothing short of a miracle. Suddenly, the kitchen table of every middle-class home in America became a factory of sweetness. One would see mothers, usually quite sensible women, who would never dream of playing with their chemistry, stirring the bright, glowing dust into the water, watching with a mixture of amusement and alarm as the liquid changed from clear to something that looked suspiciously like the contents of a radioactive spring. The children, of course, were in paradise. They were the laboratory assistants in this grand, sugary revolution, and they drank the resulting concoction with a devotion that would have made a monk blush. I suspect that the powdered smile, as I like to call it, was the secret weapon of the 1920s. We were a generation that was constantly being told to grow up, to get a job, to join a committee, and to stop asking so many foolish questions. But here, in a paper envelope that cost less than a postage stamp, was a reminder that we were still children at heart. We were still capable of being delighted by the simple, garish, and entirely unnecessary beauty of a change in color. We were still looking for the magic in the mundane, and we found it in a packet of synthetic grape. But there is a bit of a tragedy hidden in this little pile of powder, if one chooses to look for it. We have spent so much time perfecting the art of the concentrate, the instant, and the ready-made that we are in danger of losing our taste for the genuine. We want the thrill of the fruit without the inconvenience of the peel. We want the joy of the drink without the labor of the press. We are a society that lives in the packet. We are a society that prefers the easy, reliable, and standardized experience to the messy, unpredictable, and entirely authentic reality of the world. And what of the smile? The Kool-Aid smile is a temporary, fleeting, and highly suspicious affair. It stains the lips with a color that nature never intended, a vibrant, unnatural shade of red or purple that acts as a beacon for every parent in the vicinity. It is a badge of joy, yes, but it is also a badge of our own human and very American desire to color outside the lines, provided the lines have been pre-printed for us by a clever entrepreneur in Nebraska. I sat on my porch, watching the neighborhood children running about with their stained, radiant faces, and I couldn't help but feel a twinge of something. Perhaps it was just the sugar talking, or perhaps it was the realization that we are a species that will consume almost anything, provided it is sweet, cold, and comes with a promise of excitement. We are a people who live on hope and artificial flavoring, and as long as the water holds out and the sugar remains cheap, we shall continue to stir and to drink and to smile, that brilliant neon-colored smile, until the end of the century. The beauty of it all, of course, is that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that the flavor is a fabrication. It doesn't matter that the color is a lie. It doesn't matter that the whole thing is a triumph of marketing over nourishment. What matters is the moment. What matters is the feeling of sitting on a hot, dusty afternoon, waiting for the ice to melt in the pitcher, and knowing that for the next hour, the world is going to be just a little bit brighter, a little bit colder, and a whole lot sweeter. It is a moment of pure, unadulterated, and entirely manufactured bliss. And in this noisy, frantic, and occasionally brutal decade, one could do a lot worse than to seek out that bliss in a glass. I imagine Mr. Perkins sitting in his office, looking at the ledgers and the shipping manifests, and feeling a sense of satisfaction that a general might feel after a successful campaign. He had conquered the American palate not with force, but with sweetness. He had turned the kitchen sink into a fountain of joy. He had made it possible for a child in New York to experience the same identical and completely artificial sensation as a child in San Francisco, and he had done it all for a nickel. That, in its own way, is a form of progress. It is a form of standardization, a form of democratization, and a form of triumph that is entirely and characteristically American. We are a nation that is built on the foundation of the instant and the artificial. We love our canned goods. We love our telegrams. We love our movies, and now we love our powdered drinks. We want everything to be easy. We want everything to be available, and we want everything to be consistent. We are allergic to the irregular, the slow, and the rare. If it cannot be put in a box, if it cannot be advertised, and if it cannot be consumed by the million, we have a hard time taking it seriously. But despite my grumbling, I find I cannot entirely condemn the Kool-Aid revolution. It is, after all, a remarkably friendly sort of revolution. It doesn't start wars, it doesn't topple governments, and it doesn't make anyone suffer, unless you count the mothers who have to scrub the stains out of the shirts. It is a revolution of the kitchen, a revolution of the porch, and a revolution of the midsummer nap. And if the price of this revolution is a bit of artificial flavoring, well, I think we can live with that. As the sun sets on the plains of Nebraska and the crickets begin their evening orchestra, I shall raise a toast, a glass of something perhaps a bit more potent than fruit drink, mind you, to the spirit of the powder, to Edwin Perkins, the man who looked at the water and saw the rainbow, to the children with the stained lips, the silent witnesses of the sugar rush, and to all of us, the eternal consumers of the new, the bright, and the instant, who are always looking for a reason to smile, even if that smile has been painted on by a 5-cent packet of dust. We are a strange, whimsical, and entirely hopeful species. We think we can change the world with a spoon and a pitcher, and the maddening thing is, sometimes we actually do. We make the world a little smaller, a little sweeter, and a little more colorful. And we do it with the simple, charming, and thoroughly American belief that if we can just stir it hard enough, everything will eventually come out just the way we want it. And if it doesn't, well, there's always another packet, and tomorrow is another afternoon, and there is always more water in the tap. Let the drinking begin. Chapter 17. The Automated Jukebox. In the year of 1927, humanity achieved a breakthrough that, while perhaps not as lofty as splitting the atom or traversing the Atlantic in a metal bird, was far more consequential to the peace and tranquility of the average eating house. This was the year the Automated Musical Instrument Company decided that what the world truly lacked, what it was, in fact, crying out for with every fiber of its collective being, was a machine that would allow any patron with a spare nickel to become the self-appointed musical director of an entire establishment. They introduced the commercial selective jukebox, a device that effectively declared that the tyranny of the live musician was at an end, and that the era of the mechanical tyrant had begun. Previously, if one wished to hear music in a restaurant, one was at the mercy of whatever sad-eyed fiddler or piano thumper the proprietor had managed to hire for the price of a sandwich and a warm beer. These musicians, poor harried souls, played with the desperation of men who knew that if the tempo flagged for even a moment, they would be tossed back into the street. But they had a soul, or at least the mechanical capability to mimic one, and they had the power to stop when they were tired. A machine, however, possesses neither a soul nor the good sense to quit when the song is clearly over. It is a tireless, relentless, and perfectly indifferent performer that will play "Yes, We Have No Bananas" until the last nickel is spent, or until the proprietor, driven to the edge of sanity, decides to take a fire axe to the cabinetry. The jukebox was a towering illuminated box of promises, a mechanical marvel that glowed with the intensity of 1,000 fireflies and hummed with the quiet, expectant energy of a predator in wait. To stand before it was to feel a sudden, intoxicating surge of power. You didn't just walk into a diner, you walked into a concert hall where you were the sole conductor. For 5 cents, you could force an entire room of strangers, people eating their eggs, people reading their papers, people trying to have a serious conversation about the weather, to listen to your favorite jazz record. You could dictate the mood, the tempo, and the volume of the entire establishment. It was, quite frankly, a recipe for total social disruption, and the public loved it. I watched a fellow in a corner booth, a chap with a hat tilted at a rakish angle and a look of immense self-important liberation, approach one of these boxes with the gravity of a man approaching the altar. He studied the list of titles with an intensity that would have been better applied to a difficult legal contract. He selected his tune, inserted his coin, and then stood back, crossing his arms with the smug satisfaction of a man who has just tipped the scales of history. A moment later, the machine began to whir. A mechanical arm moved with the jerky, efficient grace of a harvest spider, and the record began to spin. Suddenly, the restaurant was filled with a brassy, energetic, and perfectly loud rendition of the latest hit, and the fellow went back to his booth, satisfied that he had done his part to improve the atmosphere of the world. The genius of it, of course, is that it completely eliminated the need for human interaction. You no longer had to ask the musician to play a request. You no longer had to tip the piano player to keep him from playing the same sad song for 3 hours. You no longer had to acknowledge that there was another human being in the room. You simply inserted your nickel and let the machine handle the rest. We were building a world where the transaction was the only relationship that mattered. We were becoming a society of self-contained musical ecosystems, where every diner was his own master of ceremonies, and every restaurant was a battleground of competing tastes. The noise! Oh, the magnificent, unmitigated noise of it all! You had the jukebox in one corner playing a frantic, stuttering jazz number, the clatter of silverware against porcelain, the murmur of a dozen different conversations, and the occasional indignant shout from the proprietor, who had clearly had enough of the same record being played for the 7th time that hour. It was a symphony of chaos, a masterpiece of modern American industrial strength confusion. And yet, there was a strange, undeniable efficiency to it. It was democratic in a way. Anyone with a nickel had a voice, and the loudest, or perhaps the most persistent voice, usually won the day. I suspect that the proprietors of these establishments were the real victims of the revolution. They had gone from managing a room of diners to managing a room of small-scale tyrants. One can see them, standing behind the counter, staring at the jukebox with the look of a man contemplating the destruction of his own business. They knew that the moment they installed the machine, they had ceded control of their own house. They had invited the monster in, and now they had to live with the music. There is a wonderful, whimsical quality to the jukebox, a sense that we are finally using our technology for the most trivial and, therefore, the most human of purposes. We have the ability to transmit voice across the ocean, we have the ability to record sound on a disc of wax, and we have the ability to automate the selection of music. And what do we do with it? We use it to annoy our neighbors in a diner in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. It is, I think, the perfect summary of our species. We are always looking for the biggest, most complex tool we can find, just so we can apply it to the smallest, most petty, and most inconsequential task imaginable. The machine itself was a work of art, a blend of Victorian furniture, neon lighting, and the sort of intricate exposed clockwork that suggests a secret desire to reveal the soul of the cosmos if only the cosmos had a coin slot. It was a box of mysteries, a portal into a different time, a different place, and a different set of feelings. One could be sitting in a dusty, dimly lit joint in the middle of the city, and with the drop of a coin, be transported to a smoky club in New Orleans or a ballroom in Paris. It was the great equalizer of our musical appetites. It didn't matter if you were a banker or a dock worker. The jukebox didn't care. As long as your nickel was shiny and your taste was, well, as long as your nickel was shiny, you were the king of the room. But as the years pass, I wonder what the jukebox will do to our sense of community. When we all listen to our own self-selected, self-paid for music, what happens to the shared experience? What happens to the song that everyone knows, the song that everyone hums, the song that belongs to all of us? We are creating a world of private, personalized soundscapes, a world where we are increasingly isolated in our own musical cages. We have more choices than any generation in history, but I suspect we have less in common. We have the music, but we have lost the melody of the crowd. Still, in the middle of this roaring, shifting, and remarkably loud year of 1927, I cannot help but be impressed by the sheer, unmitigated joy of the experience. Watching the crowd react to the sudden, jarring change of a record, the way they would look up, listen for a second, and then return to their food with a slightly different rhythm, is a treat that never gets old. We are a people who are always looking for the next beat, the next sound, and the next way to drown out the silence. And the jukebox, with all its whirring, clicking, and mechanical majesty, is the perfect companion for our journey. So let the record spin, let the brass wail, let the drums pound, and let the nickel continue its long, rhythmic, and perfectly predictable fall into the belly of the machine. We are a people in love with our own soundtracks, and as long as the machine keeps playing, we shall keep eating, we shall keep talking, and we shall keep living in the beautiful, cacophonous, and perfectly automated state of musical grace that we have built for ourselves. It is a loud, intrusive, and entirely unnecessary invention, and for that very reason, it is one of the most honest things we have ever created. It is the sound of America, one nickel at a time, and heaven help the man who tries to turn the volume down. Chapter 18, The Federal Radio Commission, the Ether Police. In the year of 1927, the American airwaves had become a chaotic, screaming, and altogether disorganized mess, much like a barnyard in which every animal had decided that it was the only one qualified to lead the choir. You see, the radio had caught on with the public with the sort of frantic wildfire enthusiasm that usually accompanies a gold rush or a panic. Everyone with a spool of copper wire, a vacuum tube, and a loose grasp on the laws of physics had decided to build their own broadcasting station. There were preachers shouting the gospel from their basements, farmers playing the banjo to the cattle, and local eccentrics broadcasting their opinions on the proper way to boil an egg to anyone who happened to be tuned to the right frequency. The result was a catastrophe of the ether. If you lived in a city, you were as likely to hear a symphony as you were to hear the screeching interference of two competing stations fighting for the same patch of invisible real estate. It was a giant, crackling, and entirely maddening screaming match that filled the evening air with a discordance that defied all musical theory. The listener, poor soul, would sit before his receiver, twisting the knobs with the desperation of a man trying to open a safe in the dark, only to find that his radio was doing little more than acting as an expensive paperweight for the local static. Uncle Sam, sensing that the citizenry was reaching a state of collective nervous breakdown, decided that the time had come to step in. He looked upon the airwaves, that vast, intangible, and remarkably unruly frontier, and decided that it needed a sheriff. And so the Federal Radio Commission was born. It was a new branch of the government tasked with a job that would have made Sisyphus throw his rock down and retire to a quiet life of farming. The job of telling everyone exactly when they could talk, where they could talk, and whether they were sufficiently in the public interest to be allowed to talk at all. It was a magnificent bureaucratic absurdity. You had men in suits sitting in offices in Washington holding hearings to determine the moral and technical fitness of a fellow in Omaha who wanted to broadcast his nightly weather reports. They were the ether police, the wardens of the waves, and they took their task with the somber, humorless gravity of men who believed that they were guarding the gates of heaven itself. They handed out licenses, they assigned frequencies, and they told the preachers and the banjo players to turn their volume down or face the wrath of the federal government. I find this to be a quintessential human folly. We invent a miracle, a way to send the human voice across the distance, a way to defy the limitations of space and time. And the very first thing we decide to do with this miracle is to regulate it into a state of polite, predictable, and entirely manageable boredom. We are so terrified of the noise, so frightened of the spontaneity, and so obsessed with the idea that everyone should be forced to listen to the same thing at the same time, that we have decided to appoint a referee for the air. It's like trying to put a corset on a thunderstorm. Of course, the official reason for all this was order. We were told that we needed order to make the radio a useful tool for the nation. We needed order to ensure that the news was delivered, that the music was played, and that the public was shielded from the ramblings of the local cranks. But one cannot help but suspect that the true motive was a profound, deeply buried fear of the unscripted. We don't like the idea that a man can just pick up a microphone and say whatever comes into his head to a million listeners. It's too dangerous. It's too unpredictable. It's too human. The FRC hearings were a spectacle of the highest order. You had the giants of the industry, the men who saw the radio as a way to sell soap and automobiles, arguing with the small independent operators, the dreamers, and the local legends who saw the radio as a way to connect with their neighbors. The lawyers, those noble architects of complexity, swarmed through the halls like locusts, charging by the hour to explain why their client's particular brand of static was somehow more essential to the welfare of the Republic than the static being produced by the fellow down the street. It was a circus, a theater of the absurd, a grand pageant of paperwork and pontification. And through it all, the poor listener sat at home, turning his dial and wondering why he was now being treated to a carefully curated selection of bland, mid-afternoon talk shows instead of the wild, unvarnished, and frequently hilarious chaos that had preceded the commission. We had traded the vibrant, messy, and authentically American variety of the early airwaves for the streamlined, corporate-approved, and perfectly sterile product of the new regime. We had gained order, yes, but we had lost the spark. We had polished the glass until we could see our own increasingly anxious reflections in it. I suspect that the commissioners truly believed they were doing the right thing. They were, in their own minds, the guardians of the public trust. They were the ones who kept the airwaves safe for the children, safe for the advertisers, and safe for the kind of polite, uncontroversial drivel that is the hallmark of a healthy, functioning democracy. They were the ones who had cleaned up the barnyard and made sure that only the most respectable roosters were allowed to crow at the dawn. But there is a part of me, the part that prefers a good, noisy, and occasionally nonsensical argument to a polite, rehearsed, and utterly vapid conversation, that regrets the loss. There was something undeniably heroic about those early unauthorized broadcasters. They were the pioneers of the invisible, the scouts of the spectrum, and they were doing it for the sheer, stubborn, and delightful love of being heard. They didn't care about the Federal Radio Commission. They didn't care about the public interest. They just wanted to play their music, tell their stories, and reach out across the dark and the distance to see if there was anyone out there who was listening. Now, we are all professional listeners. We listen to what we are told to listen to at the times we are told to listen to it. And we do so with the passive, uncritical acceptance of a herd of cows waiting for the gate to open. We have become a nation of consumers of the airwaves, not participants. The ether is no longer a frontier. It is a utility as predictable and as uninspiring as the plumbing in the basement. The FRC, in its own way, was the architect of our modern disconnection. They gave us a clean, reliable, and perfectly regulated radio experience, and in exchange, they took away the mystery. They took away the possibility that if you turned the dial just enough, you might find something that would shock you, something that would offend you, or something that would change your life. They replaced the adventure with the appointment. As I look back on 1927, I see it as the year the air became quiet. Not the quiet of the forest, but the quiet of the auditorium, where everyone sits in their assigned seats and waits for the show to begin. It was the year we decided that the noise was too much, that the freedom was too dangerous, and that the best way to handle the miracle was to tuck it away in a nice, neat, and government-approved box. I suppose I should be grateful. I have my radio, and it plays exactly what it is supposed to play, at the volume I choose, and it does so without a single crackle of rebellion. It is a marvel of modern technology. It is a triumph of regulation. It is, by all accounts, a success. And yet sometimes, in the dead of the night, when the house is still and the rest of the world is asleep, I catch myself twisting the dial, hunting for a bit of that old, forbidden, and deliciously chaotic static. I look for the preacher in his basement, for the banjo player in the barn, for the man who is still trying to say something that hasn't been approved by a committee in Washington. But the air is empty of those voices now. They have been silenced, regulated, and replaced by the polite, reassuring, and utterly hollow hum of the modern age. We have won our order, and we have paid for it with our wonder. We are the masters of the air, and we have never been quite so bored. And the FRC, the wardens of the waves, they sit in their offices in Washington, listening to the silence they have created, and I truly deeply wonder if they ever feel the urge to pick up a microphone and just, for once, scream at the top of their lungs. Because if they did, I suspect the rest of the country might finally wake up, grab their own microphones and start the most glorious, chaotic, and wonderfully disorganized conversation the world has ever heard. And wouldn't that be a fine, magnificent way to end the decade? Chapter 19, The Ticker Tape Delusion. If there is one thing that the American citizen loves more than his own liberty, it is the spectacle of getting rich without the tiresome necessity of actually doing anything. In the year of 1927, this national passion had reached the fever pitch of a religious revival. Only instead of salvation, the faithful were seeking the holy grail of the bull market. It was a time when the ticker tape machine, that clattering, rhythmic brass and glass oracle of the financial district, became the high priest of our collective conscience. We hung upon its every stutter, convinced that the little ribbons of paper were not merely recording the movement of capital, but were, in fact, whispering the secret architecture of a new, permanent, and entirely effortless prosperity. The stock market had transformed from a place where men of business traded shares of industry into a grand, glittering casino where the common man could place his bets on the future of the republic. Everyone was at it. The barber was trading in rail stocks. The cook was speculating on copper. The very postman who delivered your mail was likely calculating the gains of his portfolio between sorting the envelopes. It was a frenzy of optimistic accounting. People spoke of the market with the reverent, hushed tones one usually reserves for a reading of the Scriptures. And why shouldn't they? Hadn't the indices been climbing toward the heavens for months? Was it not obvious to anyone with a pair of eyes and a passing acquaintance with a ledger that the old, drab, and miserable cycles of boom and bust had been abolished by the sheer industrial brilliance of the modern age? Why, the brokerage firms were so successful, and the public so ravenous for the chance to lose their savings in the name of progress, that they began to open offices on the luxury ocean liners that plied the Atlantic. You could be 3 days out from New York, sipping a chilled gin in the middle of a vast, indifferent ocean, and still be able to trade in the stocks of a steel mill in Pittsburgh or a tractor factory in Illinois. It was a marvel of connectivity. A man could now be ruined on the high seas with the same ease and efficiency as if he were sitting in a back-alley office in Manhattan. The elevator was going up, and if the cable was starting to show a few frayed threads, no one had the time, or more accurately, the desire, to look up and notice. I spent a few afternoons observing these customers in their various stages of financial hysteria. It is a revealing study. The investor, when he is winning, is a creature of immense and insufferable wisdom. He will hold forth on the nature of the economy with the gravitas of a Supreme Court justice, explaining that we have entered a new era, a time when the natural laws of economics have been suspended by the genius of our own ambition. But observe him when the market takes a momentary pause, when the tape slows down and the prices flicker with a slight, hesitant downward tilt, and the philosopher is replaced by a man who looks as though he has just realized his house is on fire and he has misplaced the key to the front door. It is the most delightful and yet the most depressing transformation in the world. There is a particular kind of madness that takes hold when people convince themselves that the price of something is a reflection of its truth. If the stock goes up, it must be true that the company is a marvel, the industry is a gold mine, and the future is a golden horizon. If it goes down, well, that's just a correction, a minor misunderstanding of the universe that will be rectified by the next afternoon surge. We have replaced value with velocity. We don't care what the company makes, whether it's locomotives or button hooks. We only care how fast the price moves. We are not investors. We are gamblers who have simply convinced ourselves that the deck is rigged in our favor by the sheer crushing weight of our own prosperity. And the debt, oh, the beautiful, towering, and utterly precarious mountain of debt. People were buying their shares on margin, which is a fancy, sophisticated way of saying they were buying things they couldn't afford with money they didn't have, based on the assumption that the price would be higher tomorrow. It is a marvelous system, truly. It works perfectly, as long as everyone stays in the game and no one asks for their money back. It is a game of musical chairs played on a platform that is already swaying in the wind, and yet the music is so loud and the mood is so high that no one dares to suggest that the floor might eventually decide to give way. I recall a conversation with a young man, a bright, enthusiastic fellow who had the look of a man who had never known a day of genuine failure in his life. He was explaining to me how he had tripled his investment in a week. He spoke of leverage and compounding and the inevitable arc of progress with the certainty of a man who had discovered the secret to alchemy. I asked him, with as much politeness as I could muster, what he would do if the market should happen to have a bad day. He looked at me as if I had suggested that the sun might decide to set in the morning. A bad day? The market didn't have bad days. The market was a machine of perpetual motion. The market was a reflection of the American spirit. I didn't argue with him. It would have been like arguing with a thunderstorm or trying to reason with a flood. When a man has convinced himself that he is the master of his own destiny, and that his destiny is paved with gold, he is beyond the reach of reason. He is in the grip of the ticker-tape delusion. He believes that the world is as simple, as predictable, and as profitable as the little strips of paper spilling out of the machine. And, in a way, I suppose I understand the appeal. Who wouldn't want to believe that the world has finally been conquered, that we have finally figured out how to make money appear out of the ether, and that the long, hard slog of history is finally behind us? It is a seductive, intoxicating, and utterly wonderful fantasy. It makes the world feel small, manageable, and friendly. It turns the complexities of the global economy into a simple game of watching the numbers move from left to right. But the history of the world is a long, persistent, and entirely unsentimental account of the things that happen when people decide to ignore the laws of gravity. Gravity, as it happens, is very patient. It does not care about your margins, your leverage, or your new era. It simply waits, and sooner or later it insists that everything that has gone up must inevitably find a way to return to the earth. And when it does, the landing is rarely as graceful as the flight. We are, in this year of 1927, living in a moment of gilded, noisy, and perfectly manufactured bliss. We are convinced that we have outsmarted the past, that we have built a cage for the future, and that we have invited ourselves to a party that will never, ever have to end. We are dancing on the deck of a ship that is steaming ahead, fueled by the conviction that the ocean is deep enough to hold all our dreams, and that the horizon is nothing more than a suggestion. I shall sit here with my cigar and my thoughts and watch the parade go by. I shall listen to the ticker-tape machine, that clattering, nervous, and persistent little devil, and I shall think of all the people who are currently betting their lives, their houses, and their happiness on the rhythm of its click. They are having a wonderful time, and perhaps, for this moment, that is enough. But I cannot help but look at the fraying cable. I cannot help but see the horizon for what it is. And I cannot help but wonder, when the music stops, who is going to be the first one to realize that the chairs were never really there at all. But that is a problem for another day, or perhaps for another decade. For now, the tape is still clicking, the brokers are still shouting, and the world is still convinced that it has discovered the secret to eternal sunshine. It is a sight to behold, truly. It is the absolute, unadulterated, and most magnificently human expression of our ability to believe in anything, provided the numbers are rising. So, let us enjoy the ticker tape parade while we can. Let us cheer for the gains. Let us marvel at the momentum. And let us, at the very least, be grateful that we are not the ones who will have to pay the bill when the machine finally runs out of paper. That is a task for the future. And if there is one thing we have proven in this year of 1927, it is that we are absolutely, breathtakingly, and wonderfully allergic to the future. Chapter 20, 1928, is polishing its flask. The year of our Lord 1927, that grand, sputtering, and remarkably self-assured parade of human hubris, is finally drawing its curtains. It has been a year that moved with the speed of a runaway locomotive and the grace of a debutante dancing on a tightrope. And now, as the final pages of the calendar are torn away, the world finds itself standing in the doorway of 1928, a year that is currently busy polishing its flask, checking its reflection, and wondering just how much more trouble it can cause before the sun goes down. If you have been paying attention, and I hope you have, for I have been doing a fair amount of talking, you will have noticed that 1927 was not merely a year. It was an ultimatum. We threw our hats into the ring, we flew across the Atlantic, we screamed for our movie stars, and we bet our collective future on the unwavering kindness of the ticker tape machine. We have been living in a state of high-octane, neon-drenched, and perfectly sustainable madness, convinced that as long as we were making enough noise, the fundamental laws of nature would simply get out of our way and let us proceed. And now, here comes 1928, strutting up the lane like a young buck with a pocket full of secrets and a penchant for trouble. I have been watching it from my vantage point, and I must confess, it has the look of a year that has no intention of being boring. It is a year that has already decided that the party should be louder, the gin should be colder, and the stakes should be twice as high as anything we saw in the year that is currently bowing itself off the stage. Take a look at our heroes. If you can find them beneath the layers of adoration we have piled upon them. Lindbergh, that lean, hickory-whittled pilot, is touring Latin America, acting as the unofficial ambassador of the American ego, while the world watches him with the same wide-eyed, breathless wonder they reserve for a saint or a circus act. J. Edgar Hoover is in Washington, silently and meticulously filling his index cards, building a kingdom of dossiers and secrets that will, one day, make the entire country feel like it is living in a house made of glass. Al Capone, that most industrious of citizens, is busy buying himself a winter home in Miami, presumably to escape the damp chill of Chicago and to ensure that his business interests are well represented in the land of sunshine and land booms. It is a fascinating, if slightly unsettling, collection of characters. We are all living in a world that is being constructed by the people who have the most to gain and the least to lose. We are dancing the varsity drag, the Charleston, and the black bottom, and we are doing it with such frantic, jittery energy that one has to wonder if we aren't just trying to outrun the silence. We have our talking pictures to drown out the quiet, our ticker tape machines to distract us from the debt, and our flying aces to keep our eyes off the ground. We are, in every sense, a collection of dreamers who have decided that the best way to handle the future is to make sure it doesn't have time to catch up with us. But why, you might ask, does 1928 have that look of a year that is holding a winning hand? Why does it seem so certain, so smug, and so prepared? I suspect it is because it knows something we don't. It knows that the party has reached its zenith, that the music is about to become a little bit strained, and that the hangover, the great tectonic and inevitable hangover of the century, is waiting just around the corner. It is a year that has decided to have its fun, to wear its finery, and to drink its fill, knowing full well that the bill is going to be a monstrous, impossible, and entirely unavoidable document that will have to be settled by the people who are currently doing the dancing. There is a sort of cosmic cruelty in the way we prepare for our own undoing. We polish the silver, we shine the shoes, and we make sure the orchestra is playing the fastest, loudest, and most distracting tunes in the repertoire. We are like the passengers on a ship who have decided that if we throw enough streamers and drink enough champagne, the iceberg will simply decide that we are too much fun to sink. It is a marvelous, whimsical, and entirely human strategy. It is the strategy of the ostrich, the strategy of the gambler, and the strategy of the fool. And yet, I cannot find it in my heart to hate it. It is, after all, the only way we know how to live. As for me, I shall spend the coming year in the company of my own private thoughts. I shall watch the news, I shall read the papers, and I shall see what the world decides to do with its newfound prosperity and its growing mountain of trouble. I shall be the quiet observer, the man in the corner who is not quite sure why everyone is shouting, but who's having a perfectly fine time watching the performance. We are all of us actors in this grand, chaotic, and occasionally brilliant play, and I, for one, am quite curious to see how the next act unfolds. So, here is to 1928. May it be as loud, as fast, and as ridiculously self-important as its predecessor. May it be a year that remembers to keep its flask full and its eyes on the horizon, even if that horizon is beginning to look a bit dark and a bit unsettled. We are a people of the moment, a people of the impulse, and a people of the party. And as long as the gin is cold and the band is playing, we shall keep on dancing, even if the floorboards are beginning to groan under the weight of our own exuberance. It is a grand, whimsical, and utterly doomed enterprise, this living in the modern world. We are constantly building, constantly destroying, constantly believing, and constantly regretting, and through it all, we maintain the most cheerful, the most stubborn, and the most irritatingly optimistic of expressions. We are the architects of our own salvation and the vandals of our own ruin, and we manage to do both with such remarkable and such perfectly American style. As the bells ring and the clocks strike the hour, as the old year slinks away to the shadows of history and the new year marches in with its polish, its flask, and its secret knowing smile, let us take a moment to look around. Look at the people you are with. Look at the world you have built. Look at the promises you have made and the debts you have forgotten. We are standing on the edge of something, though whether it is a precipice or a summit, I cannot say. But I know this. The party is still going, the lights are still burning, and as long as there is a story left to tell, I shall be here to tell it. The flask is polished, the toast is ready, and the new year is waiting. Let it come. Let it bring its surprises, its storms, and its secrets. We are ready, we are restless, and we are, above all else, curious. And in the final analysis, perhaps that is the only thing that really matters. The ability to look at the dark, to look at the unknown, and to say, well, that looks like it might be interesting. So, here is to the future. May it be half as loud, twice as funny, and significantly less likely to blow us all to smithereens than we currently deserve. Now, tuck yourself in, stop worrying about the ticker tape, and leave the worrying to the people who are paid to do it. The world will be right here in the morning, spinning in the same old, tired, and perfectly reliable way. And tomorrow, after all, is a problem for another decade. Good night, and may your dreams be as bright, as strange, and as delightfully unnecessary as a 5-cent packet of powdered drink. The end. This has been the Mechanical Ghost of Mark Twain.